Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be interviewing people about the recent transit of Uranus and Taurus and doing a retrospective about what house it was transiting through in their birth chart over the course of the past 7 years, and what sort of themes and topics and changes came up in their life during the course of that time that we can connect directly with the transit of Uranus. All right. The premise of this episode is that Uranus just moved into Gemini last week, in the past week, on July 7th, 2025. And a lot of people are wondering then, what the transit of Uranus is going to mean over the course of the next 7 or 8 years as it moves through Gemini. But one of the things that's important about outer planet sign changes, or when slow moving planets change signs, is it always provides you with an excellent opportunity to look back at what that transit has been over the course of however many years it's been transiting through that sign, and to kind of do an assessment now in retrospect about what the changes were that it brought up in your life. And all of the planets signify change in some way. And it's just the manner in which they bring about change in our lives, the types of changes they bring about, and also the magnitude or the extent and duration of the changes that they bring about in our lives. So, for example, over the past several months, I've been doing a number of episodes about the recent Venus and Mars retrograde periods, and I showed how with the Venus retrograde, it opened up a series of changes that were happening in different people's lives, especially in the house it was transiting over that several month period that lasted almost 6 months, from like January when it first went into Pisces all the way until June when it finally departed from Aries, the sign that it retrograded in. So that was like a 6 month window where there was the unfolding of a sequence of events that related to the Venus retrograde in different ways. Or when we talked about Mars, it was a longer, like 9 month, maybe 10 month period from September when Mars first went into Cancer until June when it finally departed from Leo, having gone retrograde in those two signs of Cancer and Leo. So there again, I demonstrated how the retrograde transit was the unfolding of a sequence of events that extended over a period of time. And while sometimes there was like a singular event within that that acted as like a focal point or a trigger, that oftentimes there was this whole sequence of events that led up to that and that flowed from that that were tied in with the overall manifestation of the transit. So with Uranus, we're looking at something similar, but we're just looking at it over the course of a much longer period of time, which is the 7 years that it's been transiting through the specific whole sign house that it's been transiting in your chart ever since it first dipped into Taurus in May of 2018. For the purpose of this webinar and for this case study, I've done a previous episode. I think it was episode 197 of the Astrology Podcast, which was titled Uranus Transits Through the Houses. And we actually did that at the beginning of Uranus and Taurus, and we asked people to share different stories about what happened when Uranus transited through different houses in their chart and how that manifested. And we got a lot of really good stories just going through each of the houses sequentially, because one of the things that I've found is that this is one of the ways that you can understand all of the planets, not just the inner planets, but also if you're, let's say, a traditional astrologer and you're wanting to investigate the outer planets and what they mean and try to develop your own understanding of the significations, this is one of the ways that you can go about doing it by paying attention to these discrete periods of time when the planet is transiting a specific whole sign house in your chart. Because during the course of that transit, there will be some themes emerge that relate to that planet and the changes that occur in that specific area of your life. So for the purpose of this, we're going to be using whole sign houses where you just identify what your rising sign is, and then that sign becomes the first house, and then the sign after that becomes the second house, and the sign after that becomes the third house. Um, And I do truly think that you can see very vividly the house topics come up in the whole sign house framework at different points when Uranus is transiting through that whole sign house over the course of that 7 year period. And sometimes this is accentuated, of course, at different points when Uranus will either have specific mundane astrological transits, like if it stations retrograde or direct, that's usually an exclamation mark. When there's eclipses in the same sign as Uranus, when it makes hard aspects with other planets, like there were three Mars Uranus conjunctions in Taurus that happened over the past 7 years, or there was a Jupiter Uranus conjunction that happened at one point. So all of those things can accentuate it. And then on top of that, when Uranus actually makes exact aspects to planets in your chart, during the course of its transit through Taurus, especially hard aspects, which are the conjunction, the square, and the opposition, that's oftentimes when the specific meaning of that transit will manifest in the most dramatic ways during the course of that 7 year long transit. That's also true if, for example, there's the degree of an angle, either the ascendant, the descendant, the midheaven, or the IC. If it hits one of those degrees at some point during the course of its transit through the house, then that'll be a particularly active and potent time for the significations of that transit to manifest. But usually there's some like lead up to that or some things that happen after that as well, just as it's going through the whole sign house. All right, so those are some like basic preliminaries. I did want to show a couple of graphics that to help orient people with the dates that I was working on over the past few days and that were made for me by Madeline DeCoates of honeycomb.co. So the first one just shows the ingress dates of Uranus into Taurus. All right, so Uranus first departed from Aries and moved into Taurus on May 15th, 2018. And this is the first ingress. And for me, this is the beginning of Uranus's transit through Taurus. And it's the beginning of the time frame that we're going to be thinking of when we look back and think about what was happening in our lives starting around this time period in mid 2018 forward. Because the first ingress of a planet into a sign opens up, it's the initial opening up of the sequence of events that will then unfold, in this case, over the course of the next 7 or 8 years that Uranus was in Taurus. So it went into Taurus in mid 2018. It retrograded out back into Aries in late 2018, and then it made its final ingress back into Taurus on March 6th, 2019. Then it was just in Taurus for a very long period of time, for about 7 years, until July 7th, 2025, when it made its first ingress into Gemini. And eventually later this year, Uranus is not finished with Taurus because it's going to retrograde back into Taurus on November 7th, 2025, before eventually departing from Taurus for the final time on April 25th, 2026. And at that point, it's going to be in Gemini for the next like 7 years. So that's our time frame. And part of what that means is that the transit actually isn't technically over. And I'm doing this workshop a little bit prematurely because Uranus is going to come back into Taurus for one final trip, going through the later degrees of that sign late this year and early next year. But the reason I'm doing it now is because now that Uranus has first moved into Gemini, it's finally moved through all 30 degrees of Taurus at least once, which means that everybody that was going to get an exact transit, especially an exact hard aspect from Uranus and Taurus to one of the planets in their chart, has now received at least one hard aspect of that planet. And therefore, usually, whatever the Uranus story is, especially in terms of the house transit, should have clearly started to manifest at this point, even if there's still going to be some final surprises or final things that don't fully come into completion until later this year, early next year, when Uranus returns for one last trip through that sign. So let me show one more diagram that Madeline made for me. So, of course, Uranus in Taurus As I said, there were different points during the course of that transit that were important in a mundane sense. And if I were to identify everything, it would look something like this graphic, basically, which shows not just the ingress dates and the egress dates. Egress is when the planet leaves the sign, ingress is when it enters the sign. But it also shows the stationary dates when Uranus stationed retrograde or direct, which are like exclamation marks next to the planet, especially if it stations very close to a natal planet in your chart or closely aspecting a natal planet through a hard aspect, then some of those stations and dates would have been important for you. There was that period for a few years from 2021 through 2023 where eclipses were happening in Taurus, which indicate major beginnings and major endings and can really amplify what the Uranus transit is all about. There was a period in 2020 through 2023 when Saturn was going through Aquarius and it was squaring Uranus. It squared Uranus 3 times, which could then add some additional things on top of if you're already having a exact Uranus transits, then you were also having exact Saturn transits during that time from 2021, especially when there were 3 exact squares. There was the Jupiter transit through Taurus from May of 2023 through May of 2024, with an exact conjunction of Jupiter and Uranus in April of 2024. And then finally, there were 3 Mars transits through Taurus during this time, or specifically, I should say, 3 specific Mars-Uranus conjunctions that occurred in January of 2021, August of 2022, and July of 2024. And so those also may have acted as triggers for some Mars-Uranus events that happened in different people's lives in different ways. So that's like the more complex picture, which you then have to overlay your birth chart with, and that I'll kind of be doing on the fly as I'm going through and interviewing people a little bit in this episode. But for the most part, I don't actually want to complicate things, and I actually want to try my best to keep it very simple by just focusing on the first graphic and the ingress dates, which is that the transit started in mid 2018 and it's ending now in 2025 and 2026. What house did it transit through in your chart, and how were the topics associated with that specific whole sign house manifested in your life in some significant changes in some way? And here's a diagram that shows my traditional significations for each of the 12 houses and some of the topics that we would expect to encounter having any sort of transit through one of those houses. All right, so I think that's it in terms of preliminary stuff that I meant to say in the lead up to this before we start doing interviews. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I meant to say, but that might be it. Maybe it's time to jump into some examples so that instead of just telling you, what's going to happen, that we can actually demonstrate it through talking with people and hearing their life stories. So, through talking people and hearing their life stories, and that's one of the things, and that's why I'm doing this, is because we're going to be able to take some of these stories and then hopefully people can learn the principles of some of the ways that a Uranus transit through a specific house can manifest, and then understand then what the next transit of Uranus and Gemini is going to mean based on which house it's moving into in their chart. All right, so I've asked a bunch of people to submit examples, both from patrons of the Astrology podcast through my page on Patreon, as well as students of my Hellenistic astrology course. And so I'm going to go through and interview some of those today, and people are helping me by voting on some of the submissions in order to help filter some of them out and prioritize certain ones that are the most compelling examples. So we were going to start with the first one, which is Brianna, and I'm going to promote you to a panelist now, and then we'll jump into our first interview, which is a transit of Uranus through the fourth house. Hey, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so here's your birth chart. So let's do some of the basic stuff. So you have Aquarius rising, you have a day chart. The most positive planet in your chart is Jupiter, which is in the third house. in Aries, and then the more challenging planet is Mars, which is in the 10th house in Scorpio. And this was a Uranus transit through your fourth house. So starting in mid 2018, Uranus went into your fourth house, and then it recently departed from your fourth house, although the degree of your IC is there at 2 degrees of Gemini. So there'll be some continuation of fourth house topics into your fifth whole sign house, doubling up with fifth house topics. But what were the fourth house topics that came up for you with respect to your home, your living
Mhm.
situation, or the topic of parents?
Yeah, so and it really didn't get started, I think, until Uranus started to make contact with my ascendant degree and my natal Pluto. Like it didn't start in 2018, but in 2021, I had a really abrupt, unexpected move that happened when I was out of the country. So that
Hmm.
was very strange. And then I moved
So
again.
it was
Yeah.
like your partner at the time
Hmm.
caused you to move while you were away on a trip.
Yes.
Okay, so that was tying in the fourth house transit as well as the fact that it was like squaring your ascendant, your descendant, and your Venus.
Yeah.
That's actually interesting that you're away on a trip at the time because it also would have been squaring your Venus, which is the ruler of your
Yeah.
fourth and ninth.
Yeah, it was very strange. And then anytime I use the word weird or strange, I'm like, is that Uranus?
So was that jarring? I mean, was that did that cause tension between the two of you or what?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was not helpful at all. Yeah, safe to say it made for a weird time abroad. It was very unexpected. I had to kind of pivot and deal with it in
Mhm.
a very like sudden, abrupt kind of, it was very acute. And yeah, it definitely caused some challenges.
Some challenges and some tensions. Okay.
Understatement,
So,
yeah.
and this is 2021. I should be sharing the bi wheel because that'll probably help us visualize a little bit more. So, okay. So, do you know what month it was?
It would have been September.
September. Okay. So,
I don't know
Uranus
the
was actually
exact date.
Uranus was actually stationing at like 14 degrees of Taurus around that time, roughly in your
Hmm.
fourth house.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. So that was surprising and I'm sure like disorienting and like sudden. And then you said you had a second move later on.
Yeah. So then it would have been August of 2022. Um, I moved again by myself away from the previous place that I had moved.
Okay. And that was due to like a breakup.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
So then
that
I was very independent, which is another, it felt very Uranian.
got it. So you how comfortable do you feel talking about that just in terms of like was that partially due to like tensions that happened after the first move over the course of the next year, or was that like a long process that had been building up, or was that in and of itself something that happened suddenly?
Oh, that was a very long process that had been building up. But this was definitely like kind of the, I don't know, breakthrough is not the right word. Breakdown, I guess.
Hmm.
You know, when something's been having a stress test for a long time and then something unexpected happens. Yeah. So that was more
How
the vibe of it.
how long had you been married?
Not on paper, but together for 13 years.
Okay, that's a long time.
Yeah.
Okay. So at this point you separate and then you go out and you end up getting your own place and then you're suddenly living on your own for the first time in how many years?
Oh goodness. So it would have been since like 2009. So then what's the math on that? Like 12 years prior or
Right.
so.
Okay. So that's a
So yeah.
huge shift in terms of your living situation and like living independently on your own. And on the one hand, that being wildly different than what your life had been up to that point. but then also sometimes there can be a sense of greater freedom and like liberation and things like that.
Oh yeah, yeah, it was very di extremely different, and that's yeah, again, just like whatever was there, I feel like Uranus came through and was like, we're going to do this differently, entirely differently, and that is how it ended up, very much.
Okay. How did you experience that? What was your like internal and external process in terms of that, in terms of your living situation?
I went from kind of a normal two-bedroom size situation with a person to a tiny little like studio apartment by myself. It was so tiny, and that was actually very manageable. But yeah, everything was new. Like everything about that situation was new. Grocery shopping was new. Again, how I took care of my home was new. Everything was very, very new, even though it was like very
Right.
mundane and kind of boring stuff.
Yeah, but you had to get used to something that was almost like a learning how to do something new all over again, even though theoretically it's something you'd been doing for your entire adult life, but you're having to learn this like brand new context for doing it.
Yeah, totally.
Nice. Okay. And then did you say there was a third move?
Yeah. So then, because I noticed when you put up that graphic, the Saturn Uranus squares, though that time was the most tumultuous for me. And
Mm,
then when there was that Jupiter Uranus conjunction, May, what was that, May 2023, I ended up being able to move into this place and rent a home with a new partner. And now I'm taking care of an entire home for the first time in my life. It's not mine, but I have to take care of it and taking care of a lawn. Um, so yeah, it's been again just another new thing that I've never done before.
wow, that's amazing. And so yeah, that was in May of 2023, and
Hmm.
that was right when Jupiter moved into, yeah, Jupiter moved into Taurus that month. So that's a
Correct.
brilliant additional sort of positive expansion. And that's funny that it was an expansion almost literally, because you said you moved from like a small apartments to being in like a big place.
Yeah, it's extremely different. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Cool. All right. Well, would you say, like reflecting on the transit over the past 7 years, obviously there were many things that came up, partially because it wasn't just your home and living situation, but of course, like the Saturn Uranus square that you were describing was Saturn was like going over your ascendant and your Venus at the same time. And so obviously this was bringing into account not just the fourth house in your home and living situation, but something I commonly see, which is all of the angular houses that sometimes when Uranus goes through an angular house, especially if there's other planets or angular degrees, that it starts activating those as well. And certainly relationships went through some major changes and shakeups. And I assume your personality and yourself went through some major shakeups. And
Hmm.
even your career has gone through some changes during that time, right?
It sure has. Yeah, I left pharmacy and now I'm an astrologer.
Right. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
like a full-time astrologer, and that's been part of your journey probably since pretty early on in that transit.
Yeah, yeah, this is my eighth year of study and my fourth year away from pharmacy, getting
Hmm,
into my fifth year. So,
got it. Okay.
yeah, pretty much this
But
whole Uranus thing.
I mean, initially though, I mean that's kind of interesting because, it was opposing some of the Scorpio stuff as well as squaring Venus and like the ascendant and stuff, and as well as a descendant. And that was actually, I think, how you and I first met was you posted on Reddit that you were having some tensions about in your relationship about your partner not believing in astrology and like how other
Yeah.
people dealt with that. So that was actually part of your process as well, was over the course of this transit was like getting more and more into astrology, but that partially causing tensions with your then current partner.
Yes. Yeah, that was my Uranus in the third. Jupiter was in my ninth. I found astrology. It kind of upheaved everything. Yeah.
Nice, nice.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well,
In the
I
best way
think that
possible.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, now you're an astrologer and you've made that your full-time career. And it's kind of interesting coming out of this transit. Yeah, not just how it's shaped your home and living situation, but also how it's had there's been these other changes sort of connected with that in very weird and interesting ways.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thank you for the prompt.
Yeah, thanks for thinking about it and sharing it. And oh yeah, what's your website again for
Oh, yeah.
astrology and for consultations?
Oh, I appreciate that very much. www.aligninglightastrology.com.
Cool. All
I'm
right.
Claire Moon, by the way. I use my
Yeah.
government name. Like I just didn't even think about it, but hello. Thank
Okay.
you.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing your story.
Yeah, thanks. Take care.
All right. Bye. All right. So that was a pretty solid, yeah, like fourth house example. And one of the things I meant to mention at the very beginning, which I didn't, but that this really helped to bring up and kind of drive home, is some of the core themes of Uranus that we're expecting to see. So, I've done two whole episodes devoted to Uranus at this point. One that I did with Rick Levine on Uranus and astrology, and then another that I did on Uranus transit through the houses. And the recurring themes throughout those two episodes that you commonly see, not just that astrologers talk about, but that you actually see in examples when Uranus is prominent either natally or by transit, is on the one hand, there's themes of revolution, freedom, and liberation. So sometimes there can be this intense desire and push for freedom in a certain area of your life that you hadn't experienced previously. Or sometimes there can be this feeling of suddenly being liberated and having much greater freedom to do different things or to not be held back in certain areas of your life than you had up to that point. There can also be sudden, unexpected, and radical changes in a certain part of the person's life when Uranus goes through a certain house. So sudden changes, unexpected things, things that are unpredictable. That's actually one of the issues when you're dealing with Uranus as an astrologer, is that you can't often all you can do is predict that there will be something unpredictable that's sudden and comes out of left field unexpectedly that the person isn't necessarily anticipating. And that's kind of a funny thing then to attempt to predict, but it's funny then how persistent and how reliable that concept is that there will be something unreliable or something unexpected that will take place. Another major theme that comes up both as an external signification, but also as an internal or psychological one, is feelings of individuality, authenticity, and eccentricity. So we can often have this drive when Uranus goes through a certain house in our chart where we suddenly start having this feeling to be much more authentic to who we are and what we really want out of life, even in an area that might set us apart from other people, or even if it's a thing that might make us look eccentric or weird or going against the grain compared to what other people are doing. So sometimes when it's hitting our chart in a particular way, we experience that personally in wanting to do um, something more authentic to ourselves. But sometimes when it's going through different houses, we see that happening in the lives of people around us. So in some stories, I'm sure we're going to see that coming up where the partner starts doing something that's unexpected or something that's eccentric. Or if it's the fifth house, it might be the children that are doing something like that. Or if it's the 11th house, it might be your friend group that's doing something like that. So sometimes these significations manifest through us, but other times they manifest in the lives of people around us in a way that impacts our life in some way. Other themes that come up are sometimes themes having to do with technology, innovation, and futurism, or like thinking towards the future. People can start using technology in a certain area of their life that they hadn't used before up to that point. They can start thinking about the future more. Sometimes they can be very future oriented, but that in and of itself will set them apart or make them stand out, or sometimes even make them look weird or eccentric compared to other people. And then finally, there's sometimes this theme of like awakening or insight or genius that comes along with Uranus placements or Uranus transits. So, for example, a lot of astrologers have Uranus transits at different points, sometimes when they start studying astrology, because it can be such a radical change in the person's worldview and outlook and where their life was headed up to that point compared to afterwards. And when I'm talking to a group of astrologers, of course, they're going to be overrepresented, that a lot of them are probably having Uranus transits, or a decent number of them may have had a Uranus transit that coincided with getting into astrology. I famously have talked a lot about Uranus going over my first house and my ascendant when I got into astrology back around 1999 or so. All right, so those are some of the significations and the things I was saying that I meant to say at the beginning that we should expect from Uranus as we're talking through some of these stories. So let's jump into some other ones. So there was a good fifth house example from Chris. There we go. Hey,
Hey, how's it going?
good. Thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So here's your birth chart. You have, for those listening to the audio version, you have Capricorn rising. You have a night chart. The most positive planet is Venus, which is in Aries in the fourth, and the more challenging planet is Saturn in Scorpio in the 11th. Taurus is your fifth whole sign house, although the degree of your IC is also there at 11 degrees of Taurus. So it's importing some fourth house topics into your fifth whole sign house, and we'd expect some overlap there. And then you also have Mars in Taurus at 17 degrees and the North Node at 18 degrees. So tell me about this transit. What's been going on?
Well, I think you can kind of break it down into fifth house as well as the IC transit, with the fifth house being the more prevalent over the last 7 years or so. I think towards the beginning, you showed that the first ingress was it May of 2018?
Yeah, that's correct.
So um, this was around the time, like June 2018. I just quickly looked through my photos just now, and this was like my first major trip with my wife. We went to Yosemite Valley, and kind of spontaneously, like she's a lot more spontaneous than I am. We weren't married at the time. We had just kind of basically started dating.
Hmm.
Um, but we've been dating, I think, for probably a couple years, but this is where our relationship really started. Kind of, doing a lot of fun recreational things together. And so we went to Yosemite Valley, drove there in the middle of the night, and parked along the side of the road and got a first come first serve campsite, and just enjoyed a trip. And the a lot of a major thing that I've noticed, which has been kind of like liberating for me, is something that I've always wanted, was to have like a romantic partner to do a lot of fun activities with. And it's been in a lot of ways just like probably the best part of my life, just experiencing this. And it really is a liberating and major change from what I had before. I've done so many more like trips and had so much more fun and enjoyed life so much more these last like 7 years than any other time in my life.
Yeah,
Um,
that's really good. I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the components of the fifth house where traditionally it's associated with like fun and games and leisurely activities. But people, which often looks like a kind of weird minor signification that you wonder why that's in there sometimes if you're just reading it and comparing it to other things in the chart, like the 10th house and like career or the seventh house and marriage or the eighth house and death. But when you actually start experiencing a fifth house activation and you suddenly find yourself having much more fun and enjoyment or getting more involved in leisurely activities or like getting really obsessed with like a game of some sort that you really enjoy and brings you greater joy in life, it's actually can make a huge difference because sometimes those are some of the things that make life the most enjoyable is those things that bring fun and enjoyment.
Absolutely.
Nice. Okay.
So, that's kind of been the major theme the past 7 years or so. Recently, about 3 months ago, she told me she wanted to start having a baby, and 3 months or start, to start trying in 3 months. So this is a big sudden change for me because before she was undecided about that topic or, about that issue. And I've always been kind of like open to it, but to all of a sudden say, I want to start having a baby in 3 months, this like kind of made my head spin and kind of, you know, all of a sudden I'm like, I'm not sure if we're, going to be ready in 3 months. And interestingly, it kind of made me feel like I wouldn't have time for my own creative projects if I had a baby. Like I wouldn't have any more time, and I was kind of like rushing to get a bunch of like my projects done. And we also decided to start couples therapy to kind of like talk it over. I think the plan is that we are going to have a baby, but it's already been 3 months, or at least we're going to start trying to have a baby. But we're going to do couples therapy, and the goal is to start trying this year. And what else was I going to say
Nice.
about that?
That
Yeah.
that's awesome. So up to this point, there'd been either an ambivalence or lack of interest in having a baby on both of your parts, but all of a sudden, 3 months ago, she became really suddenly unexpectedly wanting to have a baby like very soon.
Yes. And she's 38, so that kind of plays a role in it too.
Yeah. So, but this is something that you experienced as like a surprise or like unexpected because you weren't like anticipating that, or it wasn't something you hadn't necessarily like planned out or talked about a lot up to that point.
It was major surprise for me. It was, kind of definitely through my head in circles.
Sure.
So,
Yeah. So that's something that you're still processing, and that's something that can happen is suddenly a surprise thing that comes up. And, when we're dealing with other houses in the chart, sometimes it's somebody else having a sudden change and that impacting our life unexpectedly. And that's one of the reasons why with Uranus transits, it's tricky. Sometimes people say that you can control things or you can change your mind or you can like manifest the energy however you want. But sometimes when it's like something unexpected that's coming from somebody else in your life, you have to react to and deal with that however you're going to deal with that, but that it's not something that's fully under your control because sometimes it's like changes that are coming about in other people that are then impacting you in significant ways.
mm-hmm.
So you said there might be something else do you want to mention with that, or is that, I guess that's the main thing?
Yeah, that's pretty much the main thing for like fifth house topics. You also see the IC there, and I did have some like kind of like family things going on, around that time. But unfortunately, I can't really talk about it, But it was kind of like of a Mars Uranus type of nature, and not really like the best experience. But I just thought it's worth mentioning. But it's not really related too much to fifth house things. Maybe IC.
Sure, no problem. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that'll be a thing is like not everybody will be able to go into certain transits, even if there was something that manifests, but that's okay. And thanks for giving us a heads up that there was something of a like IC component at one point as well.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing. Good luck, with everything. I hope it works out. And I think you told me yesterday that you probably will start trying soon, so that's possible maybe sometime next year as this transit's like finishing up, that could be your what's in store, yeah?
Yeah, I think there's a good chance it will be.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, good luck and becoming a father, and yeah, I look forward to hearing how it goes.
All right, thanks a lot, Chris.
All right, take care.
You too. Bye.
All right. That was great. All right. So let's keep moving on. So Lisa Page, I think yours is the next one that I was going to do. Hey, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay. So this is your birth chart. So you were born with Libra rising, and you have a night chart with Venus in Aquarius in the fifth house and Saturn in Pisces in the sixth house. And you have an eighth house example with natally your moon and Jupiter conjunct in Taurus in the eighth whole sign house. So tell me what happened and what this transit was about for you.
Yeah, so it's through my eighth house. So I was dealing with a lot of death and an inheritance and gifts and shared resources. Um, on October 16th, 2021, my dad died suddenly of a massive heart attack. And on that same day, my boyfriend proposed marriage to me. So on that
Wow.
day, it was a topsy-turvy Uranian day. So
And let me pull up the transit chart for that because that's crazy. And did your boyfriend propose first, or what was the like sequence?
um, my dad died first,
Okay.
and it was actually our 10-year anniversary kind of week, and he had been planning on proposing, and then my dad died, and then he wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do, but I was talking to him about it, and I said, "Oh, I just really feel like my dad just wants me to be happy." And he thought, "Well, okay, I'm not sure if this is the right time or not, but I'm gonna I'm gonna do this."
Right.
So that's how it
What
happened.
what was the date again?
October 16th, 2021.
16th, 2021. Okay. So here's the chart. So Uranus is up there at 13 degrees of Taurus. Um,
Exactly, trining that natal Taurus in the 12th house.
right. So it's trining your natal Uranus at 13 degrees of Virgo, and it's not too far from your Jupiter at 17 Taurus and your moon at 18, as well as squaring your sun at like 20 degrees of Aquarius.
Yes.
Okay. So, but this was a sudden, unexpected shock in
Yes, both things.
both ways.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, okay. So that's pretty big, and that's happening a little bit into this transit, and then I'm sure there was like, especially if it was unexpected with your father, that there was like a grieving process that was tied up with that, especially in terms of how sudden and unexpected it was.
Yes, and he was the caretaker for my mom who had Parkinson's, so then it was a mad rush to figure out care for her and how that was all going to work. And then the second part of the story is that she died the next year on September 1st, 2022. And that was when Uranus was exactly conjunct that moon Jupiter.
Got it. Okay. So September 1st, 2022, I see Uranus is at 18 degrees of Taurus. It's actually probably very close to stationing because the sun is almost trine it. And the nodes are also at like 15 degrees of Taurus. So this is also tied in with the eclipses that started to take place between those two signs. Um, but
Yes.
yeah, but was this unexpected when she passed away?
It was probably going to happen within a few months, but it's always to some extent unexpected.
Right. Yeah, to lose both parents within like a 1 year time frame, basically.
Right, right.
Got it.
Um, that was a 10th house perfection year for me, and that moon rules my 10th house Cancer. Um, so with her passing, I got an inheritance that allowed me to retire from my job that I had worked at for 30 years as a physical therapist.
Wow. So you spent, I mean, that's an interesting like moon ruling the 10th house, exalted in Taurus, and the eighth thing to
Right.
begin with, that you were a physical
Yes.
therapist that like took care of and like helped other people.
Right. Yeah,
And
and then
then,
that sixth house Saturn, and then I was right in the middle of the Saturn return as well. So,
okay.
or
Yeah.
no,
Okay.
actually, maybe not yet. Sorry.
You're getting ready to. I mean,
Hmm.
Saturn was already pretty close and it was getting ready to go into Pisces early the following year. So you got an inheritance and that allowed you to retire at that time at the age of what? How old were
58,
you? 58?
58.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So that's also a major eighth house component, is not just death and topics pertaining to mortality, but also inheritance and other people's money or the resources of other people.
Right, right. And then getting married in 2024 and, shared resources kind of change. And
Okay, right. Okay, so you got married 2 years later, and that was also a shift in terms of merging your finances with your partner.
right.
Got it. Okay. Um, so looking back on it, I guess you would say that those were the three themes, was those things pertaining to mortality, obviously, themes related to inheritance, but also because the ruler of your 10th house came into play, it was also a sudden and unexpected shift in terms of your career. I mean, when would you have retired if that hadn't happened? Would it still have been a number of years into the future?
Yeah, I probably would have worked 5 to 7 more years.
Got it. Okay. So that's also a good example then, just in terms of how the Uranus transit can sometimes suddenly or unexpectedly change things with respect to other areas in our life based on the houses that the planet rules, especially if there's a really important house ruler that's in the house that Uranus is transiting.
Yeah, yeah. And I
Okay.
think there's some natal promise with that exalted moon Jupiter in Taurus in the eighth that, came to pass.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's sometimes tricky when people have placements like that because there can be other psychological or other more obscure indications of like the eighth house that can be relevant and manifest at different points in the life. But then also sometimes there can be these very literal manifestations sometimes as well. And that's pretty much as literal and straightforward as you can get. And that's, one of the reasons why even though sometimes people, especially in like social media or like pop astrology, get nervous about having significations like death in the eighth house or like illness in the sixth house or other things like that, sometimes these are very important, crucial areas of our life that we all experience at some point in one way or another. And so we have to be able to know where to look at in the chart for that and how to articulate it. And sometimes the articulation can be in some instances pretty straightforward.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Now that you're towards the end of the transit, how are you processing everything, or do you feel like you're moving into a new phase of life, or that there's some sense of closure now that you've gotten a few years away from it, or where are you at now in retrospect?
I'm excited for Uranus in my ninth. I think that seems like a good place for it to be for me. Getting more into
Yeah.
astrological studies. When I retired, I started writing books, and I just published a novel this past week. And so, yeah, so publishing that ninth house kind of thing. And yeah, I'm excited for it.
Okay. So the loss of your parents and the inheritance, which allowed you to retire early suddenly when Uranus was conjoining your 10th house ruler, also suddenly gave you the freedom to pursue writing and to pursue another career that you've always wanted to pursue.
Yes.
Okay, that's really important. So that's another crucial piece then. And that actually brings in the freedom piece, which is just that even though you experienced sudden, shocking, unexpected things of a difficult nature in terms of losing two people that were close to you, a side effect of that is you also experienced a sudden feeling of liberation and freedom to pursue a career that you've always wanted to pursue at the same time, or at least that was one of the outcomes of that exact transit that maybe you weren't thinking about as you were in the middle of it, but then not too long after that, you did start to realize was suddenly available to you.
Yes.
I like that. Nice. Okay, cool. What's the title of your book?
It's called Saving Cottonwood.
Saving Cottonwood. Okay. Where
Mhm.
can people find it? Do you have a website?
It's on Amazon.
Awesome. Give me a very quick like blurb. What is it about?
It's about some people that band together to save a forest, and it's got a lot of magical realism in it and talking crows and fairies and yeah.
Cool. That sounds like my kind of book. Well, I'll check it
Oh,
out.
good.
And yeah, thank you for sharing this story with us. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for everything you do.
Thank you. All right, take care.
Thanks.
All right, that was a great example in a number of different ways. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. Right. Okay. So now I'm remembering some of these that were submitted. So Chris, who had the seventh house transit, I think I'd like to do that one next. Hey, I think it's muted still. There we go.
There we
Hello.
go. Hello. Hi, thanks
Hey.
for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. I appreciate it. Um,
Absolutely.
all right. So first with your data, which you already gave me, you have two Scorpio rising, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And you have a seventh house transit story to share?
Yes, pretty interesting one, I
All
think.
right. Well, let me put your chart up. So here's your birth chart. So you were born with Scorpio rising, 2 degrees Scorpio rising. Taurus is your seventh, both essentially whole sign house and quadrant house. And you have your midheaven at 5 degrees of Leo and your Uranus at 2959 degrees of Scorpio. So it's at the very last degree and minute of Scorpio, but still in your first house. But that also means that part of your seventh house Uranus transit essentially was your Uranus opposition at the same time by sign, building all the way up to the exact opposition by degree. So let's start from the beginning and tell me how it went.
Oh, well, it's been interesting. I'm definitely a novice, but this exercise has been enlightening. So even in preparation for the discussion, went back to the 2018 ingress, noticed some really interesting foreshadowing during that time. So
Hmm.
some disagreements, I think, with my partner at the time, some foreshadowing around career changes. So recognizing the angular influence there potentially.
Mhm.
Astrology was certainly a theme. It was the first time I really started to study at the beginning in that May 2018 timeframe. I was looking to have a child through the transit, so that showed itself during that 2018 period, and then some travel and relo foreshadowing. So that was all just during that first ingress in 2018.
Yeah, because you have the degree of the ascendant at 0 Scorpio and you have the degree of the descendant at 2 Taurus, as soon as Uranus ingresses, it's hitting two of your most important angles right away. So we would expect things to start happening pretty early on. So let's set the stage. So 2018 opens and you're already in a relationship.
That's exactly right. Thank you. So about 5 years at that point into a committed marriage.
Okay, so you're actually married. When did you get married?
We got married in 2014, 2014 officially.
2014. Okay.
Mhm.
So 2014. So you've been married for like 4 years. And then we move into 2018 and Uranus moves into Taurus in May of 2018 and begins a 7 year or 8 year transit of Uranus through your seventh house of relationships and partnership. So from 2018 forward, walk us through how it went.
Yeah. So as we move into 2019, my partner kind of makes the decision that they're going to medically transition during this time frame, and it's a big revelation for me. We're both queer, but that wasn't necessarily something I was expecting. Again, I think an important component here is that they're a Taurus rising.
Mm.
This is all moving through their first house. And that was 2019 was really, I think, the beginning of the end. Ultimately, there was a rupture in August of that year. and kind of associated with that transition. And
So, got it. Okay. So they wanted to transition, and that was um, their Uranus through the first house transit, and then you're experiencing this as a seventh house transit, which makes sense. But you stayed together. Did you stay together for a while? Because it's 2019, right? So
that's
you're not,
exactly, yeah.
but so you were actually open to it, or at least you didn't, the relationship didn't like end immediately or something like that.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So moving into 2020, May 2020, we had the murder of George Floyd, which really also surfaced in our relationship. It was an interracial relationship. And so the topic of race became really prominent. And ultimately, they wound up having their surgery that year. Later in November.
Okay. So, and just to back up, so they basically came out as trans and said that they wanted to go to transition, and you actually like it wasn't it was something that was surprising to you, but you were still in love them as a committed relationship. So it wasn't something where your relationship ended as a result of that, but you came to like adapt to it and to be okay with it, right?
That's right. Absolutely. It was certainly a learning, I think, for both of us, right? Because I was reflecting on what that meant for my queer identity at the time, and so there was a lot of learning associated with that aspect of their transition.
Right, because up to that point, you had been in a like a lesbian relationship and conceptualized yourself that way, but
Correct.
now that wasn't necessarily the case. So then you had to adapt to like what that meant and what that was like.
That's exactly right.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And um, okay, so that's part of a process for you, and that's um, ongoing. And then there's other things that come up just in terms of social things that were happening, but also other dynamics that come up in the relationship as well, that sort of come out of nowhere.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So by the time we get into 2021, we decided to relocate, move from Seattle to Atlanta, cross country, just about. And we just made that decision and relocated within a 2-month time frame. So it was pretty much immediately after their top surgery in November. We then made the decision in December of that's late 2020, and we're in Atlanta by January of 2021.
In January of 2021. Okay, so this is all this keeps coming up over and over again, but a lot of this I keep hearing about like the square between Saturn and Uranus, like we saw in the first example that was in like the fourth and first, but here we have the Saturn is transiting through your fourth and it's squaring your Uranus in the seventh. So you relocate like pretty quickly over a pretty short period of time.
Yes, that's exactly right. Unexpected, wasn't on the radar at all. And when as soon as my partner agreed that they thought that it would be good for them as well to make the move, I said let's go. I made it before they changed their mind. I wasn't really happy where we were, and so but was just really kind of waiting for them to give us the green light.
So you were the one that motivated the move.
I think I wanted to. I think I was unhappy where things were, probably with
Mhm.
life in general, and thinking that a relocation might change that. And when there was not a specific location that was on my mind, it was just where I wasn't feeling like the right spot, and so they ultimately said, "How about here?" And again, that does tie into the race relations. They actually wanted to move to Atlanta to be closer to the Black community at the time, and felt that they'd actually have more family and friends and community here.
Got it. Okay. So that was what you were bringing up about 2020 is after the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests that the element of race became much more important to your partner who is black or who was black,
That's
and the dynamic of you being in in a relationship, in an interracial relationship, became more prominent in different ways?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah, so there's just a lot of stuff coming up, and then
Yeah.
you move in 2021, and then what happens after that?
Yeah. So shortly after that, within maybe 6 months of the move, we decided to open our relationship up. So we opened it up. We had been monogamous up to that point, and decided that this might be a way for both of us to get different aspects that were missing from the relationship. But this was a new concept to us, so certainly a big learning um, for us to navigate and go through that.
And when did this begin?
That began about July of 2021, and um, September there was a moment when my partner at the time said they thought they might never be in a sexual relationship with a white person again. So that was another kind of revelation around race and um, what does that mean for our relationship, and ultimately lasted for all of 2022, this open partnership.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So and that makes sense in terms of it's like they're having a first house Uranus transit and are going through this radical transformation in terms of wanting to find what is most authentic to them
That's right.
in their sort of entire journey in many different levels with that. And then you're going through this seventh house Uranus transit and you're experiencing being in a partnership with somebody that's going through a major Uranus transit and like transformation of their identity and how that's impacting your committed partnership. So it's really interesting seeing both sides of that. And just as a side note, that's why it's kind of important sometimes, which you see pretty frequently, where you'll have one partner have one rising sign and the other have the opposite rising sign, because then they both get impacted in this way when one of them starts having transits through the rising sign or through the seventh house, and you can kind of see it reflected in each other's charts and lives.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Uh,
All right. So, okay, so you opened the relationship in 2021, and where did things go eventually from there?
yeah. So also in 2022, I got a new job, which I think is important to mention. Continued dating quite a bit, both of us. I was on an IVF treatment, so I actually decided, hey, if I'm going to parent, I'll go down this journey on my own. So that really took up the most of 2022. And then by May of 2023, my partner asked for a divorce.
Okay. Um, so May of 2023. So you were trying to conceive and have a child, and then May of 2023, your partner asked for a divorce, and this is, I'm just looking. Yeah, right. Okay. So the eclipses in like Taurus and stuff. You're actually getting towards the end of that eclipse series in Taurus, but so this is not just Uranus going through your seventh house at this point, but it's also eclipses taking place between your seventh and your first house. And my keyword for those is always major endings and major beginnings. And so this was sort of things that had been building up for quite a while at that point eventually culminate and they ask for a divorce.
That's right. Yeah, that's
Okay,
exactly
that makes sense. And that's in May of 2023.
right. Mhm.
Um, let's see. The So that's the eclipse. And then when did that happen? Was that separation immediate or when was that finalized?
So they ultimately moved out by August of that year, and so pretty much finalized then, outside of paperwork. um, uh, and then one other interesting piece here, I think, is that unexpectedly in September of 2023, at a conference out of my state, I met a completely new partner who I've been in a committed relationship with since then. New partnership in an unexpected location. We don't even live in the same country. She's in Canada. Um,
Nice. So this was the that's actually really funny because Jupiter, of course, by this point is transiting your seventh house, which I thought was kind of interesting. Because that was the divorce, but it's not just a divorce, it's also that you started a new significant relationship at that time in that year. And then that summer, that was the like Barbie movie summer when Venus went retrograde in Leo and was squaring Jupiter in Taurus. So you said you met her at a conference?
that's exactly right. Yeah, a queer conference, but our works, both of our works, sent us there.
I love that. So that
Yeah.
was the Venus retrograde in your 10th house happening at the same time, essentially that summer.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So, okay. So, and then you've been in that relationship ever since?
I have, and just the final note here is my exact Uranus opposition on July 4th. Well, when Venus was conjunct July 4th, we actually got in a pretty big, unexpected fight. I was really worried. It lasted several days, so definitely we're repairing. We're good, but it was certainly could be foreshadowing for the next that transit back into um, Taurus later in the year.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you're certainly wrapping up your Uranus opposition over the next year between now and when Uranus makes its final departure from um, that sign from Taurus next year. But it is interesting how things have sort of come full circle. And certainly that 10-year relationship ended when there was just a series of unexpected changes and your partner going through a lot of different radical transformations and changes and trying to find their own identity, and then how that ended up being very unexpected and very disruptive for you, but then also ended up freeing you up. And now you're sort of pursuing other relationships that hopefully in the retrospect you'll look back on and feel ended up being good changes or changes that pushed you in a direction that ended up being more productive in the long run.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think it was certainly best for both of us in the long run. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds like it. Cool. Well, that's actually an amazing example. I actually I saw one other example like that as well of another Taurus rising person whose partner transitioned, and then they were together for several years and everything was fine, but then the partner decided, independent of that, to get a divorce for other reasons. And so I thought it was in your chart was interesting just because I know somebody that was going through a very similar thing. And um, yeah, there's just something about the Uranus archetype where sometimes things arise that are like unexpected that you can't necessarily like anticipate ahead of time, and then you just kind of have to roll with it. And it sounds like you did the best that you could to roll with it and adjust and sort of, continue to adapt to it as best as you could. But yeah, sometimes the changes that happen push you in a different direction that maybe you wouldn't have foreseen going into it.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Really interesting.
Cool.
Thank you for the exercise. It was really enlightening for me.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that example. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so
Cool.
much.
All right.
Take care.
Take care. All right. Amazing. All right. Let's move on. So I want to like dwell because I want to talk to like everybody for a full hour or sometimes dwell and think about like what were the things we learned from that or different things. But in order to get through more examples, I think maybe I'll just move on. Yeah, I should move on. Okay. So the next person I wanted to talk to was Yukio.
Hello,
Hey, thanks for joining me.
thank you. And it's Yukiko.
Yukiko, sorry. Sorry
No
about that.
problem. No
I was misreading
problem.
the name.
It's
What's
Japanese, you know.
what's your birth data? All right, so here's your birth chart, and
Mhm.
we see that you have Leo rising. You were
Yeah.
born a little bit before sunset, so you have a day chart, and let's see, Taurus is your 10th whole sign house, and we find Saturn there in a day chart. And the most positive planet is Jupiter, which is in Sagittarius, and it's with the more challenging planet Mars, which is in the 5th house, also in Sagittarius. So this was a partially a 10th house transit for you with Uranus going through your 10th house, although it would also square your ascendant and descendant, as well as your sun eventually also in Aquarius in the 7th house. So tell me about what's your story and how did it go?
Yeah, so it's mainly about my mother. It started when she got into a bicycle accident in May 25th of 2018. So just 10 days after the ingress.
Wow, so
Um,
right after the ingress. Okay.
yes. So I live in Holland, but I'm originally from Japan. So I flew back to Japan, spent a couple of months there to sort things out. Um, and I eventually, of course, came back after a couple of months, and then I decided to go back to work, so I can visit my mom on a regular basis. Up until then, I had been a full-time mom. I moved to Holland in 2008, so I had been a full-time mom for 14 years, but I wanted to go back to work so I can at least pay for my flight to go visit her. So in 2019, May 13th, I went back to work in finance, where I was before I moved to Holland. I started working in finance, and 6 months afterwards, I got promoted as team lead. So in November of that year, 2019, I became team lead. I was working there for, a year and a little bit. And in 2021, in March, on March 11th, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. So I had to, and then I had a surgery on May 27th of that year of 2021. I had my surgery, but it was at a very early stage. So I had my surgery and that was it. So I ended up with a lot of time on my hands. And then, so during my sick leave, I found that there was something called life coaching, and I started to study for life coaching, and I became no, I was studying for it, and then at the end of that year, I was already going. The surgery was done, the treatment was done, so I was going back to work. But then at the beginning of December, I found out that I had thyroid cancer this time. So it was my second cancer. And so I had to postpone going back to work, and I went back into treatment. Yeah, so I was diagnosed on December 9th, and I had my surgery on December 28th. And then the year after, in I guess January of 2022, they found out that my thyroid cancer has metastasized on the other side, so I had to have another surgery. So I couldn't go back to work even longer. Yeah, and there was some other treatment that I needed to do. By the end of March, though, I became a life coach. And this is just about the time when I also found astrology. So I think, yeah, so I took my first astrology, it was a moonology course. I started on March 20th of 2022 and on the spring equinox. So that's when I discovered astrology. Yeah. So that
Yeah,
was,
so and that's amazing. Some of the health stuff seems like it's coming out partially because on the one hand, early in the transit, Uranus was like squaring your ascendant, but also even just being co-present with Saturn, having Saturn in the 10th house, ruling the 6th house of health and illness, means that that was wrapped up in that transit for you. Although it's also interesting how Saturn is also the ruler of the 7th house of one-on-one interactions, and it's in your 10th house, and then eventually becoming a life coach, because that's very much working directly one-on-one with other people in this sort of counseling type or advisory type role. Is something I see come up pretty often in terms of seventh house placements.
that's exciting. Yeah. So, and eventually, I did go back to my bank job, and I still work there now. And I started working, I still do life coaching as well. I also do professional consulting in astrology as well. Yeah, and then just to like close out that chapter, my mom passed away this January.
Hmm. Okay, January of 2025.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just pulling that up. Right. Okay. So this is the tail end of the Uranus transit for you. And yeah, Saturn is going through your eighth house. And then there was like the eclipses that were taking place in your eighth house. So we have those activations. And we're getting to the later part of the Uranus transit itself, which has been opposing your fourth house broadly by sign. And then occasionally transits going through there would reactivate that through the opposition with Uranus. Um, yeah, so at this point, career-wise, you still have the bank job, and then I think you said there was actually one more development that happened that you didn't mention with your
Yeah.
partner.
Yeah. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. Yeah. So last year in July, so my husband has been like the main, breadwinner of the house. He was earning more than I was, but he lost his job in July of 2024. His contract ended, and then so since October, there was no income from him. So since October of last year, I've been the only person who's bringing in money now.
Got
Yeah.
it.
So
Okay.
yeah.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, July of 2024, and there's like this Mars-Uranus conjunction in your 10th house. Saturn, again, is still transiting your 8th house, and that can sometimes be a decline in the partner's income at that time. Um, and the Uranus transit actually is also squaring your sun in the 7th house at 21 degrees of Aquarius. So then that put more of a focus on you needing to do more, becoming the primary breadwinner in the house in terms of your, not just financially, but also in terms of your career focus.
Yeah. Oh my God. Just looking at the chart and just listening to you is really overwhelming. So, because I do
Yeah.
feel that pattern on my shoulder. I totally do. And it's still like ongoing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a long journey because you started the transit as a stay-at-home mom, I think you said, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it seems like so much of it has been different ways in which you've been pushed to go back to focusing on 10th house matters related to your career and work in different ways. And like there's been a lot of other transits, of course, going on.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm focused on Uranus, and obviously there's other major transits happening at different points in a person's chart during the course of this 7-year period that we can't always get into as much. But it seems like it's pushed you in different ways towards having to focus on the 10th house more, even though it's been in the context, it's been kind of a burden or something that's been, challenging in the process of that, having Saturn there in the 10th house in a day chart natally. But you've also been developing some of these other ways of working with your 10th house, it sounds like, that are good in terms of your work with both life coaching and astrology and other sort of counseling professions, it sounds like, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And which I enjoy tremendously more than my bank job. So I
Yeah.
am I am happy that on that side I'm very happy with that.
So that
And
work is, you've found that work to be fulfilling.
oh, definitely. Definitely. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, good. So you'll be finishing that up over the course of the next year, and it seems like it pushed you in that direction. Is part of your aspiration potentially in the long term to be able to do those things more full time and to transition away from doing the bank job?
Yeah, yeah. So Uranus is now squaring my moon, so I do feel that restlessness, and I also feel like it's challenging like my sense of security, and it's like pushing me say you can be more free, just let that go, but
Mm.
I'm not there yet. Yeah,
Yeah, it can be kind of scary to make that jump and that transition to doing things like astrology full time or other professions like that where you're completely independent and relying on yourself for and other people for income and things like that.
Yeah, and my husband is he's having health issues that just came out of the blue as well, and he's a Gemini rising, so he's now going through that. So I think like my rational mind is saying, okay, you need to stay with that bank job where it's more stable. But I feel that Uranus nudging me on, you can do it. I
Right.
will get there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it does seem like you're getting pushed in that direction, and it's hard because you want the stability and there's obviously a lot of really important benefits that come along with a job like that, and it's sometimes hard to make that transition to going full time, but maybe that will be part of it as you continue that process over the next year or so, and it'll be interesting. Yeah, when Uranus goes into your 11th house, like you're saying, it will be squaring your moon in the second house, and that could be potentially helpful in terms of some of the, finding additional ways to make an income and support yourself through doing work independently, could be part of that process.
Yeah. So I hope like jumping on this call with you is a start, considering that it's Uranus in the 11th house.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so tell me about your website and like your offerings and things like that.
So my website is yukikotsubacoaching.com, maybe EU. And I'm on Instagram under Yukiko Tsuba Coaching and Zumba, because I'm also a Zumba instructor as well. Yeah, so if you just punch in my name, my last name Tsuba is a very, very rare Japanese name.
Hmm.
So if you just punch in my name, I will be there. And thank you for this opportunity to share that to the world, Chris. You're so kind and
Yeah.
generous.
Yeah, of course. I really appreciated your story and just what a 10th house transit can be like in different ways with Uranus and things coming up that are unexpected or disruptive. But I admire your perseverance and how you've been able to help persevere through that and push through that in different ways. And I think it's taking you in good directions, which hopefully you'll look back on. And even though it won't be a super rosy part of your life that you'll look back on fondly necessarily, sometimes we look back on those difficult times in our life and realize that it pushed us and forced us to go in a certain direction that we were meant to go that we wouldn't have gone otherwise. And in that sense, we can look back on it and appreciate how the universe sort of worked out in that way. So I look forward. We should check in again at some point. I look forward to hearing how it goes.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate you and this community. You're so generous. I think you're amazing. I think the community is amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. All right. Thanks for sharing your story and take care.
Thank you. You too.
Awesome. Everybody in the live chat says thank you. Lots of really good comments. Yeah. Yeah. It makes a huge difference to hear people's stories in their own words. And there's one that's why I try to do things like that. And that's why, for example, in like the houses series that I've been doing recently, I'll do the celebrity or prominent examples to get straight into the point and just demonstrate a clear correlation. But um, that's one of the tricky things about astrology is it's not until you've talked to people directly about some of these transits and heard how they describe them in their own words, or until you've lived through it yourself, certain transits, that you can truly understand it. And we just get much greater insight by talking to people directly in this way. And it's a little bit more chaotic because it's not as prepared, but I think it's still worth it nonetheless. All right, so let me go ahead and do the example with Hanur, and then I'll jump into some others right after that. All right, so I'm going to promote you to a panelist. Hey, thanks for joining me. And I think earlier I couldn't see that there was an R in the middle of your name, so your name is Harnur, right?
It is, yes.
Sorry for mispronouncing it earlier.
That's okay. I didn't even notice.
Okay, good. Then never mind. Um, so is your ascendant 25 degrees of Sagittarius?
It is, yes.
All right. Here is your chart. So you have Sagittarius rising. Taurus is your sixth house of work and health and illness. And you have a day chart. And the most positive planet is Jupiter in the fourth house in Pisces, and the most challenging planet is Mars in Capricorn in the second house. So tell us about your sixth house Uranus transit.
Yeah, so Chris, as I reflected back, it sounds like, well, I went through major physical health changes. So I had both my kids during the Uranus transits. So I had my daughter in November 2018. And I think Uranus was actually retrograde at the time. And
What was the context? Because that's interesting that you would have conceived your daughter at the very end of Uranus 2018. Yeah, the end of Uranus going through your fifth house, and then it would have gone into Taurus in your sixth, and then retrograded back into your fifth house in like late 2018, early 2019.
Mhm.
Um, had you planned on having kids? Was it planned out?
It was planned, yeah. We had had
Okay.
a loss the year before in 2017. So it was very tentative. We weren't sure what we were going to do. But then I think I decided to, yeah, just give it a go again in 2018. And then, it took. And then I had my daughter in November of 2018.
Got it. Okay. Nice. All right. And then what happened after that?
Yeah, so basically I kind of think of it as like a huge change to my physical health kind of as I started having kids. And there was a lot of like little skin issues that popped up as well after I had my daughter. It's really hard to explain because they weren't really something that necessarily stopped my life, but they were random things. So I had like a rash that came upon like after my daughter was born. And then more recently, like I think after my son was born in 2021, I developed like a sun allergy. So I'm like allergic to the sun now. And I was born in India. So that's really odd for me because I grew up, with a lot of sun. Um,
Right. Yeah. So that is something, yeah, sometimes when you have a major like change with your body or with your health, it can lead to these weird side effects of like developing other health issues or sensitivities or other things like that. And that's a pretty good. I mean, the other thing that's coming up, of course, is just that it was initially moving back and forth with the first child between your fifth house and your sixth house. And I've noticed some people where the house topics, as it's crossing over, get intertwined during that time frame. And it sounds a little bit like what was happening there, that the tail end of the Uranus transit in your fifth house of children, in some limited instances, set off some issues with health.
Yeah, in fact, like the skin rash I was talking about, it was kind of like on my like upper lip area. It was really random too. I couldn't figure out what was bringing it on. And it was like about February of 2019 that it came about. And I eventually ended up going to see the dermatologist and everything, and it resolved on its own. But it was really weird. It came out of nowhere. Like it felt really random. And I think Uranus was again retrograde through Aries at the time in February of 2019, if I remember correctly. But I don't have my ephemeris in front of me. So,
Yeah, yeah, I'm showing the animated chart here real quick, and there was like this Mars Uranus conjunction actually in February 2019 or in that range. Okay, so and then you had your second child in 2021, and then there was additional health issues.
yeah, there have been some unexplained things going on. So I've had this like weird like stabbing stomach pain or like pain in my abdomen that sort of comes and goes. And I've gone for ultrasounds and I've gone for another kind of exam I can't remember the name of right now, but they couldn't really find anything. And so every time it's kind of like, well, just keep an eye on it. It could be like related to a muscle or like some kind of inflammation of some kind, but it's very odd that no one's been able to figure out what it is. And
Hmm.
more recently, it's been calm. I haven't had the episode again, but it would be like a really sharp pain that I would get either when I would sit down or go from sitting to standing. Um, so yeah, that was another thing aside from the allergy of the sun that I developed. So
Yeah, so ongoing, just kind of like bizarre health issues has been a thing throughout the course of this, and other sixth house things have come up as well.
yeah, lots of six house. Yeah. So So I started my own healing. I went into like my own therapy work. So I'm a therapist by profession, and I started my own therapy work in early 2022. So I've been kind of contemplating it towards the end of 2021. I was just having a really hard time. There's also eclipses happening in my 6th and 12th around that time. So November
Mm.
2021, I think there was a Scorpio eclipse in the 12th. But that seemed to have really set things off where I was like, okay, I really need to go. And then I kind of was able to make the connection and show up for therapy by January of 2022. But the kind of therapy I started doing, it was very life changing for me. It was very different from anything I'd ever done as a practitioner before, as a therapist before, anything I'd indulged in before. And it really changed the way I was able to start working on my healing. And so as a result, I found it super helpful that I started learning it. And so the same year, 2022, I believe Jupiter was in Pisces at the time, because it was kind of like this lottery system to get into the training. And I got in like on my first try, which was like unheard of. And so I was able to learn the modality and then start offering it to my clients as I went back to work in July of 2022. So it's been again life changing, and I would say completely shifted. I would call it like the biggest breakthrough I've had in my therapy work, if I were to describe it in that way. And I think everybody I've met in that community feels the same way about it. And not to keep it a mystery, it's called IFS, Internal Family Systems. And so it's been very different with how I used to practice therapy before. And so that's another aspect of the sixth house transit, I feel.
Nice. I love that. Yeah, and it's cool because it ties in with how Uranus, when it was transiting through the middle degrees of Taurus around this time, was trining the ruler of your sixth house, which is Venus and Virgo in the 10th whole sign house. And you're bringing some of those healing or like therapeutic modalities into your career with Venus there, and that the Uranus transit is positively accentuating some of that in terms of both your work and your career.
Yeah, yeah. I think I remember in May is when I had applied, and May of 2022, and then I got in by July 2022. And I remember there was just like a sign on TV. I was watching something, and it was kind of like you kind of have to go for it. And I just decided to go for it, and I applied and I got in. It was just it was such an odd moment because I was like, oh my God, I've heard people have been trying to get into this training for years, and I just got in. And my therapist was surprised because she was like, you got in? And I'm like, yeah. And so anyways, it's changed the way I work. It's completely changed. Yeah.
Nice. That's brilliant. Yeah, and here's the eclipse, for example, at the beginning, May 1st of 2022 at 10 Taurus, and Uranus was at 14 Taurus at that time, trining your Uranus almost exactly. So I love that as a precursor to that. And then how did things go now that we're getting towards the later part of that transit and sort of wrapping up? Was there anything else that came up over the past few years?
Um, I'm trying to think of the past 2 years. I mean, lots has happened. So, another underlying theme that came up as a result of having children and my physical health kind of changing so much, was that like the daily routines and, sort of like how we run our life has completely shifted for us, for me, especially as a mom, as to like how I used to spend my time before and how I spend my time now. I find I have zero time for myself, of course. So, that has kind of gone downhill. So I would say like my physical health and my physical appearance or how I take care of myself has completely, kind of gone downhill, if
Mm,
I could put it that way, because that's how I feel. Like I can't find any time to take care of myself. But then also I wanted to just add, like back in 2022, when I was learning IFS, when I did return to work for my maternity leave in July of 2022, I actually ended up going into eating disorders, which I thought was really interesting too, because it's like, again, sixth house, which can be associated sometimes with diet. I also have that Venus in Virgo there. And so it was really interesting that I then started working with eating disorder clients. And then they were the first clients I started using IFS with. And it's also interesting because IFS was originally sort of the founder of IFS, Richard Schwartz. He founded it when he was working with eating disorder clients as well. So it was just an
mm,
interesting juxtaposition. So um,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah, I like
yeah.
that. That's
So
interesting in terms of the Taurus and Virgo having connections with like foods and things like that and the foods we eat. So is that is the Uranian component partially with that it's something that's kind of unique and different in the healing or therapeutic profession? Like, I'm curious if that's like a component of it or how to understand how that's different compared to other therapeutic approaches.
Yeah, Chris, that would be essentially it because it's a more specialized area of practice. And prior to that, I had been more in generalist practice, as we call it. So, you work with sort of everything under the sun, anxiety, depression, personality stuff, psychosis, anything that sort of walks in the door. But this was the first time I decided to do something a little bit more different or specialized. And so I think in that it was a little bit different for me. And I think the Uranus transit maybe speaks to that. Again, going through the sixth house, health related, because everything
Mhm.
that I was working with was very health focused. We were working with food a lot. So, like the program that I was in, it had an inpatient component, it had outpatient and day treatment. And so I was literally responsible for feeding clients. So we would sit and have meals with them and make sure that their food intake was okay. And if they weren't, then we would have to supplement it or, sort of sit with them until they were able to finish their meals. So it was all very like meal and food oriented work.
Nice. I love that. Okay, brilliant. So, yeah, so you went into the transit with one approach, sort of in terms of your work and your career, and you kind of emerged from it with a much different, like radically different approach in terms of that. And then do you feel like now getting towards the end of it that you have a better handle on some of the weird like health things that came up early on, or where do you feel like you're at with that?
Yeah, I mean, most of them seem to have been resolved on their own. So I don't know if they'll resurface. We'll see. But I think, yeah, the skin issue was resolved on its own, like on my lip, it like sort of just disappeared. And I was like, okay, I'm really grateful for that because, yeah, that was like a little bit of like a problem for me because to having to cover it up and stuff. And then the stomach issue hasn't resurfaced. So, yeah, I would say health wise, things are okay. And I'm hoping that as Uranus leaves my sixth, maybe I can start taking better care of myself. I'm not sure if it had anything to do with it, but I'm sort of making that association because everything sort of started happening around the same time. I started having kids in 2018, and then sort of I feel like my physical health stuff just went downhill from that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was reflecting on that today about how sometimes when we're in the middle of really long-term transits, something arises that kind of takes over our life or becomes really prominent, and it seems like it could never end or that, it'll be permanent that way. But sometimes it's weird how when a long-term transit does end and it shifts into a different sector of our chart, suddenly something that seemed so prominent and was dominating our life in different ways during the previous period can sometimes fade away mysteriously as we move into a different era in our life. So, we'll see in terms of that. Hopefully, that's the case with you in terms of that transit as you finish up that sixth house transit. But yeah, otherwise, it sounds like you were able to use it like very productively, and some really positive things came from it in terms of your job and your work and being able to help people with sixth house issues. So it's nice that you were able to, yeah, have some really positive things happen in that context.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess one thing I forgot to mention was also that I had to change jobs a lot of times. And so it wasn't always something that I wanted to do, but just kept happening. So I had to leave eating disorders because it wasn't working again for my lifestyle. And so it was a very busy program, very demanding, and I needed to have more time to do things, and I wasn't able to do that. So I was looking for a way out, and I ended up taking this other job that I originally didn't want to take, but then I ended up taking it because it was sort of on the way to my son's daycare. And so I thought this way I'd be able to, drop him off, which was taking us 2 hours a day to do, and also be able to just go to work and not have to sort of do two things separately. So it was again tied to, I guess, my kids and, how they came into my life and then structuring my life and my work around that. So I picked a different job, but it wasn't really something I wanted to do. And then last year, around the time of, so this happened in end of October 2023 is when this took place, the job change. And so I think end of, or yeah, end of
That,
November
that
20.
was an eclipse in Taurus, end of October 2023.
Yeah, so there's that eclipse as well. And I was also grateful for Jupiter transiting through there because I feel like it kind of brought me that job because it was a
Mm,
complete slowdown. It was the very opposite of eating disorders, where eating disorders was very busy and hectic, and I felt like I was losing my mind.
mm,
I was able to go to this other clinic, which was in a rural setting, and it was completely slow, and there wasn't much going on. There was like four clinicians there, and it was like very isolated where it was located in a residential setting, and there's like no coffee shops around, which I really missed, but it was like very like, I felt like it was very like a complete slowdown. And so it's very different from eating disorders. And then I landed there, I believe, November of 2023, because I started end of November 2023. And then I was there for about a year. And then that Libra eclipse that happened in October of 2024, I got plucked from there, literally. They decided they were going to move me to another rural clinic because we weren't busy enough at that clinic. And so this other rural clinic was busier. So I had the lowest seniority there. And they decided that, I was the person that they were going to make move to this other clinic. And it completely changed my routine. So my daily commute and my routine, and mind you, I was also a third house perfectioneer since last year. So that also tied into it. But I am now driving 2 hours a day to, do the drop off for my son, then going in a different direction to my work, and then driving back to go get him, and then in a totally different direction to go home. So it's completely changed my routine as well.
wow. Okay. Yeah. So that's another big thing. And it's interesting how some of those changes, like I said at the beginning, are sometimes getting triggered by important things like the eclipse in Taurus that you mentioned in October of 2024, or that period where things slowed down for a bit when Jupiter was going through Taurus and going through your sixth house, which is helpful in terms of balancing out. Otherwise, Uranus can have this kind of frenetic energy when it's all on its own.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think the eclipses definitely impacted me, and they do seem to impact me more. I'm basically like a full moon, like, native, if you want to call it that. But yeah, the Libra eclipse last year was literally right on my MC because my MC's at, I believe, 10 Libra, and it was like 9 Libra or something. So it really did a number on my career and work related matters. And then it was all tied in with everything that was happening with Uranus going through probably as well. So I don't know if the eclipse had more of the effect or Uranus, but I just thought I'd mention that. So,
Nice, nice. Good. Well, I think that's an amazing example, and I think that gives us a lot of good insight into some of the challenges that sometimes people run into with the sixth house, but also some of the positive ways that people can use it as well, and some of the positive things that come from it. So thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it.
of course, thank you.
All right, everyone says thank you. That was a great example. Okay. Yeah, that might tie in some other stuff. Let's do your example, Grace. Hey,
Hi,
thanks for joining me.
thank you for having me.
All right, so you have an 11th house example you'd like to share, and you just gave me your birth status. Let me share that for those listening to audio version. You have Cancer rising, and you have a day chart. Jupiter is in Pisces, conjunct the degree of the midheaven in the ninth whole sign house, and Mars is in Aries in the 10th whole sign house, and let's see, Uranus through Taurus was your 11th house, and it would have been squaring some eighth house planets you have, including Neptune, Uranus, the Moon, and Venus. So tell me uh, how it went and how it worked out for you.
Yes. So the main thing that happened for me was that there was a ton of changes within my friend groups. I was in college in 2018 when the transit began. I was 20. So the main thing that happened around, I think you said in May is when the transit began. But for me, in about the fall of 2018, early 2019, my childhood best friend and we kind of fell apart. We started to have some things going on. There was a lot of stuff with social media and like some subliminal posts and things like that. So I
Mm,
decided to kind of distance myself from her. And then another situation that I ended up having with a friend is that, so I mentioned that I started a business for college because I was thinking about the themes of like the 11th house with like money from your business and hopes and dreams and stuff. But I started a business in college that I ended up doing out of my house. And one of my roommates, who I was a friend with, I feel like there was some secret hidden animosity. I feel like she was probably jealous about the way that a lot of things had happened and blew up with my business. And things just got really weird. This was a college apartment. So there were four of us, four girls, four of us living in the apartment at the same time. And she kind of had disconnects with all of us, but because me and her were the closest and I was the reason why she was even kind of living in the space. And this was around, I noticed that things really kind of started to lead up to this, but we had our altercation and we actually physically ended up fighting multiple times in January of 2020. That's when things kind of really hit its peak.
Okay.
But yeah, lots of crazy stuff with friends for sure.
January of 2020. So you were living with a group of friends basically for college essentially, right?
Yes. And
Okay.
this was somebody that I knew because I went to college about 45 minutes away from my house. I wasn't super close friends with this girl in school, but we went to the same school. I've known her since we were like little kids. So I've known her. We were always cool. But the fact that we got to college together and we were like, oh, I've known you forever. We might as well start to be friends. And we started to become friends, truthfully, around, I would say, around the time that Uranus did enter Gemini. Around 2018 is when we really did start to get close. And then around January, February of 2020-ish is when everything kind of hit the fan.
Okay. Got it. So you had this altercation around January and Uranus stationed at some point. Oh yeah, Uranus was actually stationing at the beginning of January, around January 10th. So there's a real intensification of that. And then you have this major conflict and altercation with friends. And then did that change your living situation or what happened after that?
Yes. She ended up moving out of the apartment. And it was just the three of us for the rest of the school year living there.
Got it. Okay. And what happened after that, or what's the rest of the transit been like for you?
So after after that kind of tempered off, everything was pretty much fine. I started to another thing with like social media and friends and groups and things like that. I started to around 2021. I ran that business in college. I started this, and also my lot of fortune is in my eighth house. I mean, not my eighth house. I'm sorry, in my 11th house. And I
Mm,
noticed that I won a lot of this stuff with the money and the pitch competitions and grants and money for my business that I won. I noticed that Uranus was conjunct my lot of fortune at that amount of time when a lot of that stuff started to happen too. But I started the business, ran that business, and I decided that I don't really wanted to do that anymore. And I started to have an interest in astrology. So I started your podcast, of course, was a great help. Started listening to your podcast, started discovering other sources. And then I decided to start talking about astrology online. And now I have a TikTok account that I've grown. I hit 80,000 followers today, where I talk about like a lot of different astrology stuff. I've started to post on YouTube. I've grown my business and I've been doing readings now for the past 3 years. But social media has been a huge part of not just the astrology stuff, but also even with the stuff that I was doing in college with the skincare business that I had. I would post because I started my business in 2019. I started selling soap. And then, a couple months later, we had the pandemic. So everything kind of blew up. I was posting about it and I started to get like a lot of different customers, and a lot of stuff happened internationally with that. But yeah, social media was, and connecting with people and groups was a huge, huge, huge part of the past couple of years for me, honestly.
nice. That makes so much sense. Okay, so the part of the core of it is that you're leveraging technology through social media, which is 11th house and like Uranus, and then in some instances that was actually really resulting in a lot of like financial benefits. And it's interesting that the ruler of your 11th house is Venus, which is in the eighth house, um, relatively well placed with that nice Moon Venus conjunction that reminds me of one of our earlier examples where there was a major inheritance. But in your case, it's using technology and social media, especially, which is a 11th house thing, and having good financial benefits. So you said you made quite a bit off of the first business.
Yes, within I had my business open from 2019 to 2021, and within those 2 years, I made $250,000 just selling products straight up. My college that I went to also had a really good business program, and that's why I even started the business. I was an entrepreneurship major, and we had to start and run a business to even get to be able to graduate. So I
Hmm.
had a lot of support, and even thinking about like the connotations with like networking and support and people who can help you with that. The College of Business was instrumental. We had my school really championed entrepreneurship and people kind of doing things for themselves. And we had different pitch competitions in 2020. I was that 20, no, I think that was, I don't remember if it was 2020 or 2021, but I also won a pitch competition for my school. I won $10,000. And I don't know if you all are familiar with Shark Tank, but Damon John was one of the judges. And I got to talk to
Oh,
him. I got to have a conversation with him about business and things like that. It all happened
nice.
virtually because this was in the middle of the pandemic. But yeah, a lot of crazy stuff happened relating to some of those topics for me, for sure.
Yeah, that's super cool. So Uranus would have been like squaring your natal Uranus in the eighth house, as well as your moon and Venus there in the eighth house. And then over the past few years, um, a large part of it has been getting into astrology and then building a social media presence and profile. And it's interesting how much that's become important in like modern times of developing a following. And you said you reached 80,000 followers recently.
Yep, literally this morning on TikTok, I hit 80,000.
And do you know when you started your TikTok or started doing that?
I started posting around in 2022, I think summer 22. I remember I started just looking at celebrity charts and posting things. And I remember this was around the time that Nick Cannon was having all those kids, and we have a birth time for him. And I was like, I looked at his chart and I seen that he had Jupiter in his fifth house. So I made a TikTok video talking about, like, this is ironic. This man has a bunch of kids and he has Jupiter in his fifth house. And then from there, I just kind of started posting a bunch of different astrology videos. And it took a while to really start to gain some traction, I would say. Like from 2022 to 2024, I think within that 2 year range, I maybe had gained like I think it was somewhere between like 6 to 8,000 followers. But then within this past year, I would say really since like spring of last year, I started posting consistently. Like sometimes on TikTok, I will post like 20 times a day, just going crazy with the posts. And my channel has been able to accumulate a lot of different things. Now, something else, astrology is my primary focus on TikTok, and that's how I've gained a lot of followers. But I also do like a lot of local content, a lot of food reviews, a lot of local experiences, and things like that as well. That I've also started to do, and I could even see a connection with that as well too, because I do a lot of promotion for people, and a lot of people have told me like I've helped their businesses, and I've built a lot of relationships and done a lot of networking with these people as well too.
Nice. I love that. I love that. So, yeah, connecting with people and building. It's interesting how you're talking about the summer of 2022 and starting that, and that's the same eclipse basically that happened at the beginning of that summer that was happening. Eclipses were happening in Taurus that was in our last example in Harnua's chart that was in her sixth house, and some of the th sixth house things were happening there. But for you, it's like starting to post on TikTok basically and starting to post astrology content there. And it demonstrates one of the things I often talk about with eclipses, which is sometimes it's very small beginnings that you don't think are super significant at first or don't appear to be, but it's like planting a seed that will grow and develop and turn into something much bigger later on. And if you started at that point, 3 years ago, and now it's turned into 80,000 followers, then that certainly seems to be the case.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I didn't even think about that and that the eclipses were there, but for sure, yes.
Yeah. So do you feel like now that you're coming to the end of that transit, aside from just having a lot of followers, do you feel like you've made a lot more contacts and like friends and associates or groups at
Yes.
this point?
Absolutely, because even through just me posting more social media stuff, I've made friends on TikTok. I've made friends on Twitter, and even just seeking out and engaging more with other people who are interested in astrology and some of those other things. Definitely have started to build communities. Even for myself, I've launched my own Patreon now, and I have some subscribers and things like that as well. So really just, a lot of community oriented things that I have going on right now, definitely.
Nice. Awesome. What's your TikTok so people can check it out?
Moon ruled mommy, because I'm a Cancer rising.
Nice. I love that. That's good. Um, Perfect. Well, that's actually a really great example. So thanks a lot for sharing that.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
Okay. So I like talking to different people I haven't talked to before. Christine with the Uranus ninth house transit. Did we talk before recently? Because I'm trying to remember if we did, if you were on a recent episode already. Hey. All right. What's your birth data?
November 5th, 1996, Harrisonburg, Virginia, 1:56 a.m. The time.
All right. Is your ascendant 13 Virgo?
Yes.
All right. So you have a ninth house example that you wanted to share with us. And for those listening to the audio version, we're looking at a chart with Virgo rising and Taurus then is the ninth whole sign house. Um, your natal Uranus is at 0 Aquarius, so that's going to be your square as soon as uh, Uranus moves into Taurus, just like in our last example. And then your Sun and Mercury are in the third house in Scorpio. So at some point in the middle of that, there would also be an opposition to those third house planets. So tell me what happened and what you want to share about your Uranus ninth house transit.
Yeah, that literally, it was wild when you posted the thing. For this talk or whatever, I thought about it and I was like, oh my God, whenever I tell my friends about my life, I always talk about this whole Uranus in the ninth house period without me relating that to astrology. But I talk about these last many years as me becoming me. So it literally changed absolutely everything. So right before it moved into my ninth house, I had started to do a little traveling, but pretty much let me look at the dates for stuff. So the first biggest thing that happened was I went to an ayahuasca ceremony, and that was in I think it was November timeframe, and it
Of
changed
2018?
in 2018. Yes, and
Okay.
it changed my whole life. I met this random guy. I was in a relationship with someone else, and I met this guy. We had attraction, but I was in a relationship. I didn't really understand what was going to unfold between us, but I was like, didn't think it was romantic. Ended up following him home to Connecticut after this ayahuasca ceremony and telling him all about my story. So I was going through a whole major transition of my life with my philosophy. So I was like a girl who was in college, had like acrylic nails, designer bags, and I basically decided I wanted to sell everything I owned and just like live off the land because I felt really depressed. I started studying permaculture. So I got my permaculture certification right at this time. So I went to this ayahuasca ceremony, met this person, and then that escalated to him.
Really quick, the ceremony, did you travel to South America for that?
No, So it was a
Okay.
shaman that was a connection, and he comes in. So it was in Ithaca, New York, where it
Got
was.
it.
And
Okay.
so that happened, and then in that escalated into its own thing. But January 2019 is when it was basically late December that I got told that this guy that I met at the ceremony, his mom would pay off all of my I had two apartments, long story, but would pay off both of my apartments, buy me a new car, and if I was ready to move now. And I wanted to move to California. I just wanted to be on the West Coast. So I moved across the country January 2019. I had 1 day to pack everything from my place. So I packed what would fit in a car and my two dogs and broke up with my boyfriend. He had no idea. This was all random, and moved to California and started living on wolf farms, like these volunteer farms, and just doing farm work and working. So that was like the biggest thing. And then from there, I have the other events that exploded. But that was like humongous change right from January 2019.
Got it. Okay. So part of the ingress was a sudden relocation to completely different part of the country and doing something completely different than what you'd been doing otherwise.
Yes. And so that spiraled and spun into then my whole new life. That was a completely whole new thing. So I went through learning to farm. I had to deal with like, I still had like acrylic nails. And so people were like judging me, like, you're not capable of doing this. So then I was like, yes, I am, and had to show myself through applying myself majorly to the farm. I stayed there about like 8 months. And then I decided I wanted to just do my whole own thing. So I found this off-grid commune deep in Northern California. And I moved there and spent the next 2 years from 2020. I moved there to this commune off grid, and stayed there until about 2021, 2022 is when I started coming out from there. So that was like a pilgrimage on its own, which is very like ninth house. And I was completely alone. So it was a commune, but there was no one there. So I was alone, and I like met with, long story. But anyways, I ended up being there alone for 2 years, off grid, farming, homesteading, all on my own, and went through such a mental remaking of who I really am, from that.
Okay, that's amazing. It's funny in this example and a few, like we keep having these earthy sort of like Taurus and sort of significations coming up related to like food or like land or other things like that. And I think it's been funny how much that's come up in very specific ways. So you're living on your own and it's different in terms of you're living in a different place, so you're in like a foreign surrounding, and you said this was impacting your beliefs in some way.
Yeah, so around that time I found your podcast, and I found it was like I was off grid. So I would go to town, found your podcast, and I would download all these long episodes, and then I would leave town and go back, and I would just be taking care of the goats and the chickens in my garden and playing you in the background, like studying astrology and kind of like obsessing. So that was the start of my obsession with astrology. But then it grew because I ended up relocating again back to Virginia in 2022 for 8 months, totaled my car, had to like figure all that out. The end of 2022, around June, I ended up back in Northern California, now living in the same area that commune was, but like a little less off grid, but still very deeply off grid. Instead of 3 hours from a town, I was 2 hours from a town, and I was living in a yurt. And then I started to like deeply study astrology. 2023, 2023, I then went to work on a glacier randomly in Alaska, and had never, that was also interesting. That was around the eclipse. That was around the Taurus eclipse thing that I noticed through someone else's story that
Which
happened.
what month?
Okay, so when I went to the glacier was the summer of 2023. It was
Yeah, so maybe
May.
the May eclipse, yeah.
I
So the
literally
same.
went there in May. I went there May and stayed till September.
Yeah, so this is the same. I think it's the same May eclipse that, or it's one of the eclipses that everybody keeps hitting on. It seems to be important to a lot of people is just because when the eclipse happens, it's then activating the Uranus placement even more. So then you went to traveled even further afield and went to an even more kind of weird or eccentric kind of situation.
Yeah, yeah, definitely weird. It was like a sled dog camp, and I was the cook for like 30 people, which that then activated me realizing I loved what I wanted to do as a profession and become like a farm to table private chef. And that's what then I ended up like launching by the end of that. So now Uranus is in my 10th, and that's kind of what my focus is on, is creating my own businesses and stuff. But yeah, so I feel like I hit all of the ninth house themes, other than education, which I guess it's like I bought your course during that time. I did do the permaculture certification, but they're not like the long school education stuff. But other than that, I feel like I hit every ninth house topic during that transit.
Nice. Yeah. So you traveled around a lot. You went to a lot of very eccentric living situation places. I think it's kind of interesting how animals were coming up a few different times, and your Uranus is in the sixth house natally. So it was getting squared by the transit. And a lot of the stories you're talking about involve like animals or like living places with animals. And then there was an educational component in terms of getting into astrology and studying that, as well as some of the other educational things. And now you've sort of emerged from that, and a lot of that was preparatory, which the ninth house usually is, to the bigger transit of Uranus going through your 10th house and some of the career focus that that'll be over the next 7 years.
Yeah, it felt like this whole Uranus in the ninth house was me becoming me. Like I had no clue who I was before. And it was all these messy, unexpected events, but they all played this story that now I can look at now that the transit's passed and be like, oh, wow, all of those led to each other. Like everything led to each other. And the thing about animals that's fascinating, because I have two dogs and they're my only constants in my life. And I got them both a year before Uranus entered my ninth house. So they were the only thing that came with me to every single thing and has like stayed my constant. So yeah, that's interesting that there is that correlation, and animals and my pets were definitely huge in that.
Nice. Yeah, that's brilliant. And then part of it also was a changing of your philosophy and outlook in life in terms of where you were when you went into the transit versus where you are now, sort of emerging from all of that.
Yeah, I was a very fiery person that was kind of like bitter and not very nice. And now I'm still fiery, but only in my activities, like I like climbing and things like that. And I'm very grounded, mellow, and very sweet of a person now. Like literally people who knew me before, they're like, you're a completely different person. And it was that Uranus in the ninth house.
And you feel like it was because of the experiences that you had during that that changed your outlook on life in different ways?
Completely. Yeah.
Nice, nice. All right. Well, that's a really good example. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on again.
Cool. All right. Take care.
Thanks.
Yeah. Gail says she learned a new lifestyle. That makes sense. Yeah. In the ninth house and just your personal beliefs and philosophy. And sometimes that can be like really radical, um, like religious shifts, especially. But sometimes it's like your personal philosophy of life and how that shifts as we have significant ninth house transits. One actually, let me see if they're still here. No, they're not still here. It would have been interesting to do a little contrast with that. There was one other submission from Andrew who said he had a ninth house transit, and he said, I had a big change in religious beliefs and had a very difficult time finishing my bachelor's degree due to lots of chaos in my life and the world. So that's, would provide like an interesting contrast just in terms of different ways that the same transit can be experienced based on how our natal chart is set up and people reacting to it in different ways. All right. So looking through, Nicole in the chat says, fellow Virgo rising, and our story is amazingly similar. It's crazy. Also a traveling farmer and changed so much and lots of crazy events. Yeah, it is fascinating how the different experiences, depending on the natal chart with the same transits, everyone's chart is set up so differently with the rulers of the houses and like the natal planets that are getting hit and different things like that, as well as what environment you grew up in and everything else. Stephen, if you're still here with the 12th house transit, that could be a good example. Hey,
Hi there,
thanks for
Chris.
joining me.
Perfect.
What's your birth data?
It is the 6th of June, 1978.
So here is your birth chart. You have Gemini rising. You were born just after sunrise, so you have a day chart. Jupiter's in Cancer in the second house, and Saturn and Mars are in Leo in the third house. And this transit of Uranus would have been through your 12th house, and it would have opposed your natal Uranus in the sixth house at 13 degrees of Scorpio, and then also later at some point squared your Saturn and Mars later in Leo. So what happened and what was the transit about for you?
Yes, well, 12th house is quite a challenging transit, if I put it that way. Um, I, from a career perspective, I've always been someone who's really been driven, um, very focused on what I would do in terms of work. And what I found was that the Uranus transit, to a certain extent, made me realize that I wasn't necessarily taking care of myself. So um, very basically, in terms of my job, had a situation where we got a new international president in our local country office who was a very exploitative boss. I worked directly for him, and it all came to a head by about the 23rd of January 2020, when I um, basically hit a total breakdown and realized that I needed to get a medical intervention. Um, was diagnosed with burnout and major depression. From that, went into a therapy and a institution for about 2 weeks to basically do some psychological work. And as you know, directly after that, as I came out, basically we went into COVID lockdowns. So it was totally an isolative period. Um, and then, yes, in terms of that work, by the end of that year, December of 2020, I left, or we did a mutual separation with the company I was with. And I was basically unemployed and living at home for about 9 months in that following period. So really a time that brought me into that 12th house of isolation, of really facing myself, dealing with where I am. And what I've found since, in terms of the rest of that transit, was that the period really made me a lot more isolative, a lot more focused on what my own needs and my own shadow work was. So really, 12th house in that type of environment. Um, and yes, looking forward to at least moving into Uranus into the Gemini period, because that means that hopefully we move to something that can help me with the changes I need in my personal life as well.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, that hits on three really important 12th house significations. One of them is enemies or people that we don't get along with in our life, or people that are doing us harm in some way or detracting from our life. One of them is mental health, and focusing on our mental health can be part of going through the 12th house. And then another one can be themes of isolation or seclusion, and how that contrasts with the 11th house, which is about socialization, as opposed to the 12th house, where you then encounter more themes of seclusion and being on your own, and sometimes finding ways to be okay with that, or to even thrive in that sort of environment. So going back to the first one, could you tell me more about some of the themes you encountered with your boss, because you were really in a situation where he became almost like an enemy in some way?
Yes, well, if I put it this way, a Korean boss that was very much a dictatorial type of personality, the type of person who would come into meetings and literally humiliate anyone that he deals with. So, and I'm quite empathetic when it comes to people. So I really took on a lot of the energy that comes from that. And it, ironically, he was moved into that position just as Uranus started ingress. So it was a literal situation of for the next few months dealing directly with this person and reporting directly to this person who was highly controlling, very difficult to deal with in a cultural and a personal type of level.
And did that happen in like May of 2018 or in mid 20 or in 2019?
In the 2019 ingress, yes.
Got it. Okay. And that's really interesting because that's something I try to explain to people and tell people, which is pay attention to little changes that happen at the beginning of a transit, especially not long after an ingress, because sometimes a little change that you might not think is going to be a big deal or have any reason to think is going to be a big deal at the time could turn into a much bigger deal or could foreshadow some things that are going to come up in the future later on. Because presumably, like when that change first happened, you wouldn't have assumed that it was going to turn into this whole big thing or that he was going to be a jerk or cause you so many problems or hardship or mental anguish. But then eventually it sort of became that as time progressed.
Yes, I think the thing was when he moved into that position, I wasn't in a position where I would even report to him. So my direct boss actually left the country and left his job, and I got promoted into the position that reported into the MD much later that year. And initially, it wasn't something I knew of the type of personality that I was dealing with. But by October, I was promoted, and from October until January, I went through a very, very pressured period from this boss. And um, incidentally, also it was a sixth house perfection year, which is ruled by Mars. So I do feel that that malefic was then also activated in that period.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Um, So you start dealing with these issues and of like having somebody who's causing you mental anguish and who you're having tensions with, and that's something I often say is that traditionally it's enemies, but one of the ways that I phrase that sometimes for in modern times is just people you don't get along with in your life, and that the 12th house sometimes is that's the area in the chart where we find people we don't get along with for different reasons, whatever those reasons are. But then one of the things that comes out of that is that it does eventually cause you like a physical burnout, both psychologically and physically to some extent, right?
Yes, definitely. Both physical and psychological. So I didn't actually realize that there was a psychological element until I actually got physically ill, as in anxiety made me go into the level of throwing up from a buildup of anxiety. Every morning I would wake up and just not be able to function due to that anxiety. And it is literally that type of element of um, for me, this was a case of really realizing a lot more about myself due to the fact that prior to this, I most probably already had a certain level of burnout or a certain level of pushing myself too hard. But it was a case of this specific event to a certain extent made me a lot more aware of the type of anguish that I was going through.
Yeah, and how your sort of mental state in the 12th house can sometimes affect your physical health as well, with that this being part of your Uranus opposition with Uranus and Scorpio in the sixth house. And so eventually, this culminated and you ended up separating from that job when?
In early December 2020.
December 2020. Okay, got it. So that's interesting because that's right after Saturn makes its second ingress basically into Aquarius. And then we start the Saturn square with Uranus as well as squaring your sixth house Uranus. So you go into a period of sort of like isolation and being more on your own over the next few years.
Uh, yes, it was a period of, let me just quickly check the dates there if you don't mind. Basically until November of 2021 was basically when I started again in a office environment after that period of isolation.
Okay. So you go into an office environment, and then what happens after that?
Then I was there for about, I'd say 2 years, and then by quite suddenly by October 2023, I went into a remote working environment, which is again quite isolative, but
R-
working remotely, still in the same type of environment, but in a really very good job environment that I'm still currently in.
And that was, did you say October 2023?
Yes, beginning of October.
Nice. Okay. So that was, by now Jupiter is moved into your 12th house, and it's that year when Jupiter's in your 12th house. And then by the end of October, we get, I think it was the final Taurus eclipse, which is a full moon in lunar eclipse in Taurus in your 12th house. And Uranus is already at like 21 degrees of Taurus, so it's starting to move away from the exact opposition with Uranus in your natal chart in the sixth house, and then you're doing remote working from home, and this is essentially a much more optimal situation for you in terms of your mental and physical health.
Correct. So yes, I might still be quite isolated in a certain extent, but what I do find is that there is a connection, at least in terms of the people that I work with, and a again quite an international type of thing. And what's interesting with it is because I work from South Africa for a US company, it means I am out of sync with a lot of my normal. Um, with my normal type of community or my normal friend circle to a certain extent. So it is physically my work in ensuring to a certain extent that I also then spend my mornings on my own because everyone's at work when I'm off and I work when everyone's off again. So that type of context.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, there can be in addition to the ninth house, oftentimes being about foreign travel, the 12th house that can come up as well in terms of interaction with foreign countries or places or things like that is pretty common. So now that we're reaching the end of this transit, essentially, do you feel like you've become more? I mean, it's interesting that in the one sense, part of the Uranus transit also was using technology because you're using technology to work remotely in this position of being more in seclusion or isolation, but then connecting with people through that and still doing your work and job. By the end of that, do you feel like end of the transit, do you feel like you've become more accustomed to and adapted more to that way of thriving within the context of being in isolation more? And do you feel like your mental health, with the changes that have been implemented, do you feel like you've learned a lot more about your mental health and about what you need to do to take care of yourself, both mentally and physically?
Yes, definitely. I think by the end of this period, I I'm a lot more aware of my mental health triggers and the typical elements that, or signs that there is burnout on the way. So, where in the past I would have just thought, oh, this is interesting and moved on and continued. Now I would say, hold on, I'm putting in a day or two for leave and I literally do my mental health days. So I've learned a lot in this period and I do believe that it's equipped me quite strongly for the future.
Nice. I love that. I think that's great and a really good example of how yeah, learning one's limits and how, while sometimes the 12th house can bring up difficulties, by the end of that transit, oftentimes there's a lot of growth and a greater sense of finding what's necessary and what's authentic to you in order to grow and thrive in the world. And it sounds like you've been able to do that. So, yeah, so good job.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that example. I appreciate it.
Perfect. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too. Good example. And, one of my access points for understanding the 12th house's mental health, that's something that's emerged over the past several years, is just thinking back to the planetary joys scheme in Hellenistic astrology and how the entire bottom half of the chart and the houses below the horizon are in the sector that pertains to the earth and to the moon, and that there's like a physicality to the houses in the bottom half of the chart, whereas the houses in the top half of the chart are above the horizon in the sector that relates to the sky and to the sun and to the more intellectual side of things, of the intellect, which is nous in Hellenistic astrology, which is associated with the sun and the mind. And when you apply that to the sixth house, 12th house, sometimes part of the distinction can be the sixth house and physical issues that we deal with, physical ailments, whereas the 12th house can sometimes be more like mental issues that we deal with. So, yeah, that's part of the basic distinction that I've tried to develop and tease out there, which brings into account some very modern concepts, but also is still very much rooted in the traditional framework. And that's something, I'm trying to demonstrate here today as well about how a Hellenistic astrologer would have approached investigating the outer planets and trying to see what they mean and what they do. Like if you took Vedius Valens or you took Ptolemy or any other traditional or ancient astrologer and you plucked them out of their own time period and you put them in ours and you said, there's this new planet that's just been discovered and it's called Uranus. This is its time frame. It takes 84 years to go around the chart. And while some traditional astrologers might say, I don't know, some of them, let's say one decides not to use the outer planets and stick with the traditional system. For the most part, like astrologers are very curious and inquisitive people, and I do think that most of them would have tried to figure out what these planets mean. And one of the ways that they would have gone about doing that is what we're doing here today, which is just simply seeing what the transits of those planets look like when they go through different houses in the chart. And that's one of the most basic and obvious ways that you can come to some understanding of what the outer planets mean, especially with Uranus. So we've seen a lot of commonalities between these different stories, I think, even though the transit itself has applied to different houses in the chart or has activated different natal placements. Yeah, so that's been really good. Let's see. Renata submitted one a while ago that said third house Uranus transit, several changes to my neighborhood and frequent neighbor changes. Random car issues kept occurring. Hey, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to help out.
Yeah, what's your birth data?
So it's December 17th, 1981.
All right, so here's your chart. And for those listening to the audio version, we're looking at a chart with Pisces rising. The third house is Taurus. This is a day chart with Jupiter in Scorpio in the ninth and Mars in Libra in the eighth. And let's see, Taurus, the primary things that there's hard aspects to are an opposition to Jupiter at 3 degrees of Scorpio at the beginning and a square with Venus at 5 degrees of Aquarius early on. So what was your third house Taurus transit like?
Sure. So I started kind of noticing around 2018. I live kind of like in an area that was just a couple of houses and apartments, not that kind of on the outskirts of the Charlotte area. And then they started adding a police station. My neighbor had a farm, and they were contacted by the hospital in the area, and they told them they would pay them like $1 million or some high sum to sell their farm so they could build a hospital. So like I no longer have just like farmland beside me. It's like, and then they started building like just a bunch of shopping centers, and it totally looks different. Like there's traffic everywhere. So it went from being kind of like just a more like seeing just strawberry farm to seeing just a sprawling like area where people are just shopping and things like that.
That's incredible. That's perfect. Yeah, that's definitely something I've seen when there's major third house transits, is just a change in terms of your neighborhood. And in your instance, like a radical transformation in terms of your surroundings outside of or in the vicinity of your home, essentially.
Yeah, and then also as you guys were talking, because I know I talked about like the other the other thing with my car. I never had car trouble. I would always you just kind of find, maybe a flat tire. And then it was like just random check engine lights. I was like, like even what was it? It was I want to say if this is July, a couple of months ago, I just had I was just driving down the road and my car just stopped like mid driving. So, and I had to get a brand new engine put in my car. So just major sudden car repairs. And then when I called the people to tow my vehicle, they told me, "Hey, I got an idea. I want you to contact this dealership. They're they're fixing the engines on I have a Hyundai Sonata, and they were like they're fixing them due to like a recall that they had." And I called, and they were like, "Everything's free. Don't worry about it." And but that wasn't the first vehicle. I had went through several vehicles in 2017, and they were just like everything just was kind of breaking down. So I saw that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
And
that's
then,
been an ongoing thing, just like issues with your car throughout this transit.
yes. And I believe it was, I have the date, but in my phone, I'll have to kind of look through here. But I want to say, no, I actually know when it was. It was April Fool's Day. I remember distinctly. Um, I made contact with someone who says they're my cousin. They were, my uncle had supposedly, he's um, had a child that our family didn't know about. And I guess is it like 23andMe, one of those like genealogy things.
Mhm.
They contacted like one of my second cousins and they found me. And it's like, so my family let my uncle know that I, have a cousin that I didn't know about. And he says
And this
that
is April Fool's Day, what year?
this year, this year.
This year, 2025. So April 1st, 2025.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go, you were saying, sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah. Oh no, you're fine. And that was my last, because I thought about that and I was like, oh yeah, I did have a family, because I know a lot of people think of siblings, but I also think, and cousins as well. And my cousins for me are like my brothers and sisters. A lot of us grew up as like siblings. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So you were contacted on this day, and that was funny because that was the day of a Moon Uranus conjunction in your third house, and you found out unexpectedly that you had a cousin that you never knew of.
Yes. Yeah.
That's amazing. I love that.
Yeah.
Nice. And have you kept in touch with them since then?
Yeah. So, a matter of fact, I just talked with them the weekend of the 4th of July. Just kind of just making contact and getting to know them. So,
Nice. That's amazing. I love that. Um, that's just like there was another person, I don't know if they're still here, maybe I can talk to them afterwards, but who had a unexpectedly they had a fourth house transit basically and unexpectedly found out that they were not their father was not their biological father. So sometimes there can be surprising genealogical things that come out with Uranus.
yeah, my family, because my daughter is 23, and so she studies alongside with me. And we were both Pisces risings, and we were both looking at our charts, wondering what our fourth house would look like. We were like, oh wow.
Right.
We're like, wonder what, we're hoping it's just moves. But we're like, I wonder what family secrets will come out. But yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So the um the change over the past 7 years, though, in terms of your neighborhood from living essentially like in the country or living near farmland without many people around you to suddenly there's like a almost like sprawling city that's grown up around you has been one of the more dramatic, obvious
Yeah.
changes in terms of your third house environment.
Yeah, because and I remember too, like I live in this apartment complex. I don't remember the date for this, but I do live in an apartment complex, and it was it used to always be blue. That was kind of like the reason why I like the color blue. And they like wrote us and said we're gonna paint your apartment so like now it's white. And me and my daughter were like, oh, we don't like the white, but it was it was just this like randomly they were like it's gonna be painted, and so yeah, we've adjusted though.
Yeah, well, and what's funny about that is a lot of those different additions and changes that happened at different points in the past 7 years probably happened around some of these different turning points, like the eclipses or
Yeah.
Uranus stations or like other things like that.
Yeah. Because I was looking and let's see if I can. I remember because I was trying to pull when they broke ground on the,
Mhm.
let's see here. And I
Okay.
do have a date. It was they broke ground August 22nd of 2019. And it was kind of a big deal because it was like we're like right in the outskirts of a major metropolitan area. Well, we were, now we're in it. But and so
Yeah, that's perfect. That well, ironically, that was another Moon Uranus conjunction in your third house that day. And it looks like the sun is almost at the trine of Uranus. So that means Uranus was stationing around that time. Oh, wait, no, it was before that. So August 22nd, you said?
2019.
There it is. It had just stationed around August 12th and 13th. So that was also a Uranus station, which, like I said, it's sometimes just like an exclamation mark where you find out more about what that transit's going to be about when the outer planet stations there.
And then the hospital, I don't have the exact date, but it was June 2023 of when the hospital opened, which was huge because it was just like because the girl, one of the children went to school with my daughter. Uh, and so like, just just kind of a big deal, like to go from a farm to a hospital.
Got it. Okay. So that was Jupiter's going through your third house, and we're still finishing up some of the eclipses there. Like there would have been an eclipse that would have taken place right before that, which was one of the eclipses that we keep coming back to, like in May of 2023,
Yeah.
April, May. Nice. Yeah, well, that makes sense, and it's a good example just because then that's changed your neighborhood and your surroundings, and then there sometimes that can have an impact eventually on one's actual like home and living situation. Like you mentioned, changing the colors of the paint and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But also just other people in your
Yeah.
area and your neighborhood eventually as well that you run into on a regular basis.
Yeah. So neighbors moved in and out a lot. Like it was just constant moving. Yeah. I think with the changes, with everything going on, a lot of people decided to move and kind of change.
Okay, so there's a lot of disruptions in terms of that as well, and in terms of your neighbors.
Yes.
Cool. All right. Well, that's a really good example of like a third house transit and just the different things that can come up, and also your perceptiveness of sometimes it was like major things, but also sometimes just noticing during different parts of our life, there's little minor things that come up more frequently as well, like different car trouble that you're having throughout the course of that, and how that's probably going to be another one of those things where once the transit's over, after a few years, you'll realize like I haven't had like a huge car incident or something like that in quite a while, and think about how it was during that transit versus outside of it.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for sharing your example. I appreciate
No
it.
problem. You guys have a great day.
You too. Okay. Um, did we not do a second house example? And did somebody have a second house example? All right. Does anybody have a first or second house example that's really striking, or it might be time to wrap up for the day? All right. Were there any? Yeah, I think that might be it then. So it's funny that we didn't do a first house example since those are often the most notable ones. All right, that might be good for today because I know we're getting towards the end of this and I'm starting to get tired. So let me, I think, do some conclusions. All right, so I think that's good for examples. We didn't get to the first house and yeah, second house, but we sort of incidentally got there through some other examples. Like one of the relationships one, we talked about somebody that had Uranus going through their first house. And you can watch the other episode that I did of Uranus transits through the houses for some other examples of those two and the things that can come up where the first house can be about your personality, your appearance, your body, but also broader things about your outlook or your focus on life. And the second house, of course, about finances and possessions and income and other things like that and things connected with that. All right, so I think that's it for this workshop. So thanks everybody that shared an example. I really appreciate it. We had a lot of really great stories today, and I appreciate everybody who was willing to open up and share their story, even when we were talking about some difficult things. So I hope this has given people some ideas, again, just by defining our time frame of first ingress in the middle of 2018, and now we've reached the last ingress early next year. Everyone's Uranus transit through Taurus is not completely over yet because Uranus will retrograde back into Taurus later this year before departing finally next year. So for some of you, there may still be some final wrapping up and some final sweeping up and sort of assessing and taking into account the entirety of the transit that isn't completed until sometime next year once Uranus departs from Taurus. And especially for those of you that have planets in the last few degrees of the fixed signs, especially like the last 3 degrees of the fixed signs, there may still be some really important events that haven't taken place yet, where the transit sort of culminates towards the end of Uranus's transit through that sign, rather than those, for example, who had planets or sensitive degrees earlier in the fixed signs, where it sort of culminated or got going and got intense much earlier. So pay attention to that and keep an eye out for it. I hope this has given everybody some ideas about some themes that you might expect in terms of now that we're looking at Uranus going into Gemini and some of the themes that you might anticipate as Uranus moves into a new whole sign house in your chart. Like I said, pay attention to themes that have started to emerge even already this month. There may have been some minor changes in your life or things that are happening in the background that could end up becoming much more important than they might seem at first, since we're starting a 7-year long transit of Uranus through a different sector of our chart and activating a whole host of new topics in a new area of our life. One thing that I will say is, I mentioned this once, but I do notice that there can sometimes, during this intermediate period where Uranus is going back and forth between two signs, it's also going back and forth between two whole sign houses in our chart. And sometimes that period can connect the house topics in interesting ways during the course of that period. So for example, when this transit started, Uranus was going back and forth between my third house of communication and my fourth house of home and living situation. And I had this experience where a few people came through town, like a large part of the Uranus transit through my third house in Aries from like 2010 till 2018 was about starting to do the podcast and learning all the technology of doing audio and video that it took in order to turn the astrology podcast into what it is today, and to leverage technology in order to communicate was a large part of my Uranus transit through the third house for like 7 or 8 years. But then Uranus started moving into my fourth house of my home and living situation. And part of what happened is I had this experience where a few people came through town and I wanted to interview them, but I didn't have a good setup for that in my little like basement apartment. So I wasn't able to interview them in person. Or one of them, like I think it was the Priscilla Costello episode when she came through town for like a book event, and she gave a talk for our local astrology group and did a book signing for her book on Shakespeare and astrology. And I ended up trying to like go to her hotel and we tried to record there, but just like the audio and the video was terrible. So I think I only released like the audio recording of that episode and I didn't release the video because it was so bad. And after that experience and like two others that happened around that time, I decided to create a recording studio in my living room and start so that I could interview people when they came through town in Denver. And that was my initial experience around that time of Uranus retrograding back and forth between my third house of communication, where I'd recently started doing video versions of the podcast, and my fourth house of home and living situation. And it kind of like intertwined those topics for a period of time. And then, of course, during the course of this transit, there's been some different notable interviews that I've done here in person in the studio, even though I haven't been doing those as much the past few years. But one of the funny ones was the Uranus episode that I recorded with Rick Levine. And right at the beginning of that episode, we were recording together in the studio in my house, in my apartment. um, right at the beginning of the episode, the power went out like 1 minute into the episode, right after I'd introduced it. So it's this funny sort of like legendary Uranus fourth house transit that I had at the very beginning of that episode that people can go back and watch now. It's like an outtake, I think, at the end of the episode. So pay attention, though, to things like that, where during this time you may see some overlaps or some connections that are taking place between the two whole sign houses that Uranus is going back and forth as it's making its way out of Taurus and moving into Gemini and sort of setting the stage for some of the themes that are going to grow and develop over the next 7 years. Um, yeah, so to conclude things, this is how I would go about, this is how my approach to studying transits and rooting it in both the ancient approach of Hellenistic astrology by using things like whole sign houses, paying attention to whole sign transits and aspects, paying attention to things like sect and traditional rulerships, but then also bringing into account some modern concepts, including the investigation of modern planets that were only discovered in the past few centuries. And I think when you do that, you really can root the practice of and the use of new concepts and techniques, like the use of the planet Uranus. You can both root it in a traditional framework, but you can also investigate and verify what the planet means so that you're not just taking that for granted from what people say or what you read about it, but by actually investigating what the transit looks like when it's going through different houses in a person's chart. So that can be difficult because it takes very long periods of time in order to do that. It takes, 7 or 8 years for Uranus to transit through a specific house in the chart. So that's obviously a much longer research project, but that's why these periods around the ingresses of Uranus into a new sign are so valuable because it gives us a rare opportunity to look back and reflect on the past 7 years while it's still somewhat fresh in our mind and to assess and reflect on all of the changes that have happened in that area over the course of that transit. So I hope everyone has learned something from that today. And yeah, be sure to check out the other episodes I did on Uranus with Rick Levine or Uranus transits through the houses for more examples of what you might expect of Uranus transits through certain houses. But otherwise, I think that's it for this episode of the Astrology Podcast. So thanks everyone for watching or listening, and I'll see you again next time. If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to find a way to help support my research, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to subscriber benefits such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, the monthly electional astrology podcast, an exclusive podcast series called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to patrons on my producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bozbaz, Kwatsi Alabarahu, Annie Newman, Ginger Sodlier, Berlin West, and Nikki Crawford. People often ask me if I'm available for consultations, but unfortunately I'm not right now because the podcast takes up so much of my time. However, I did create a consultations page on the Astrology Podcast website that has a list of astrologers that I recommend for astrological consultations. You can find that at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software we use here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is astrology software for the PC. You can get a 15% discount by using the promo code AP15 at the website alabe.com. For Mac users, I recommend the software AstroGold for Mac OS, which is astrology software for the Mac computer made by the creators of SolarFire for the PC. You can get a 15% discount with the promo code AstroPodcast15 through their website at astrogold.io. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then I would recommend signing up for my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, plus monthly webinars and Q&A sessions, and then at the end of the course you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me if you pass the final written test. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. Finally, shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the United Astrology Conference, which is happening September 3rd through the 9th, 2026 in Chicago. Find out more information at uacastrology.com.